Hello, everybody. Let's see, are the microphones working? I'm delighted to start the afternoon with a subject that is a real hot topic today, with political, social, financial, monetary consequences. How do we manage inflation? So inflation is a concept that we thought had disappeared. And it's suddenly come to the surface again over the past few months, and we will continue to hear about it. There'll be lots of debates about it by economists across the world. So I would like to thank our 5 guests. Now, we'll just check whether the connection with China is working. And before introducing everybody, I'm going to hand over to Jean-Paul, who is the coordinator of this session, and he will be giving us the outline and asking questions. Yes, thank you very much, Beatrice. So this isn't a scoop. Inflation is back in most advanced countries. So the thing that's more surprising is that it comes and goes when you expect it least. You know, we have several decades of moderation, and since 2012 in Europe, inflation was below 2%. In other words, it was low in relation to the objectives set, notably the objectives of central banks. So we were worried about that situation. We were so worried that when the health crisis came along, we were afraid of deflation because this is a terrible thing, according to economists. And because we thought that deflation would rear its ugly head, we focused so much on stimulating economies using budgetary policies, but also monetary policies. And yet, one might wonder whether it wasn't possible to foresee that this contracted supply, because of disruptions in production processes due to the health crisis, notably due to lockdowns, together with a higher demand through monetary and budgetary means, one might have wondered whether this wasn't going to lead to an increase in rates. So, you know, was it as surprising as all that? So we're not there yet. The increase in prices, it's not inflation. Inflation, you know, in academic circles, we define it as an increase, a general increase in price levels that is kept up. And for this to happen, you have to have this terrible race, a price race, you know, prices of products at all stages of the production process. And then you have that famous spiral, price and salary. And those are the secondary effects. So for inflation to settle, you have to have a distribution conflict somewhere. So starting with that idea, well, it can actually help us to understand the solutions that may be used in order to manage or better control inflation. Now, we know lots of these solutions. There's the solution that consists in orchestrating a hardening of economic policies in order to reduce or get rid of market power of some entities in the circle. But we do this at the price of a reduction in economic activity and a reduction in employment. And there are other solutions. The state, for example, could take on part of the increase in prices. It could cover, and that seems to be the wish in France. However, the underside of that is that it has a big impact on the state budget, and that's costly for the balance of public economics. Or we can control prices. Now, this reminds me of my youth. Of course, we have to understand that any control leads to rationing phenomena and inefficiency phenomena in particular. So then you have the income policy that was used in many countries, as much in the UK as in the United States, as in France. This income policy consisted in bringing social, there was a social dialogue about salary levels. But this social dialogue has to exist, and we have to have the right conditions for good social dialogue. We have to have all of those conditions brought together. So that's all well and good. But at the end of the day, wouldn't a better solution shouldn't it be quite different from what we've heard? Place economies on a higher growth path. In other words, having a higher growth, more sustainable growth, guaranteeing an increase in overall income that can then be distributed, and something that would help with the distribution conflict that I was referring to earlier on. So this is all to be done. It's about structural policies, not just policies based on the economic climate. It's not a problem of supply. It's a problem of supply rather than demand. But the work is ahead of us. The work to focusing on solutions, and hopefully, the debate will bring in solutions to these different questions.
Jean-Paul.
Thank you very much, Jean-Paul. So, you've launched some questions. So, let's have a look at who we have for the debate. Of course, we can't have a debate like this without Mr. Trichet. Thank you very much, former president of the European Central Bank. Next to you, we have Luis Pereira de Silva. You are General Assistant Manager of the Bank of International Settlements. Thank you very much. We also have Jean Bernardo, your President of the Board of Directors of HSBC Continental Europe. Then we have Paul Hermelin, Chairman of the Board of Capgemini. And do we have our connection with China? Earlier on, it was working. Yes, hello. Hello, Mr. Justin Yifu-Lin. You are Professor and Dean at the Institute of New Structural Economics in the University of Peking. You're in China. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you very well. I'm so delighted.
Fine, thank
I'm
you so much.
connected, finally.
Okay.
So I'm going to start with the first question that I'm going to ask you, all of you. So it's a collective question. We were surprised, weren't we, by this increase in inflation. It was so fast. It was so worldwide. What about if everything had been written ahead of time? If we had had wind of it beforehand? Because we were all kind of blind to it. Mr. Trichet, what do you have to say about that? Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you. It's lovely to be here with so many friends. So first and foremost, yes, the surprise was huge. It was a huge surprise, as Jean-Paul was saying. Jay Powell, the head of the Fed, was saying at the end of last year that inflation was transient. And here we had 2% of inflation in 2022. That's what was thought. It was based on analyses and the model of the Fed. So the surprise in Europe was huge. And I will just give you the multiplication of the underlying inflation, the core inflation in the jargon. So within a year, we went from 0.9% in the Eurozone to 4.6%. In other words, that's a multiplication by a factor of 5. So that just shows that something very powerful has happened. And now on both sides of the Atlantic, we've got 8.6% of deadline inflation, and that was in May in the United States, and in June that's what we had in Europe. So to explain the effect of surprise, as Jean-Paul said, there was this feeling that there were no more problems of any kind. We had the same feeling with the moderate decades before the subprime crisis and what I experienced at that time. So we've made the same monumental error. So when we see that interest rates are very close to zero all the time, you know, you've got to be very wary of such trends. There are many reasons that can explain what has happened, and this is my concise response to your question. Before the war in Ukraine, why have we observed on both sides of the Atlantic, as Jean-Paul has said, in all advanced countries, why have we seen this explosion in inflation? First of all, you've got the end of COVID, you've got supply and demand, together creating an inflationist situation which should have been anticipated but was not. Then you have monetary policies, very commodity-based, not just because of COVID, but since the Lehman Brothers event, because of there was the materialization of inflation, the inflation risk that was feared by all central banks on both sides of the Atlantic and more generally in all advanced countries, justifying ultra-accommodating monetary policies, budgetary policies that were also very much accommodating. Larry Summers said, he said, long before the war in Ukraine and long before the end of last year, he said, be careful, the budgetary policy is going to create a lot of inflation. And today, you know, that's what's happened. And he was right about it. So that was the third reason why that's where I see a real cause of inflation. Then you've got deglobalization. I think there's a real phenomenon there. Re-examination of world value chains, the vulnerability of these value chains. That's what we're seeing. You know, any guarantees against disruptions to these chains. Then there's the green transition that's really increased the investments to be made. And then there's this inflation aspect that is underestimated, I would say, with this green transition. That, you know, we've got the real interest rates going up in the world, and at the same time, the Central European banks have to manage a different monetary policy. So that's why we have bigger interest rates. Now, perhaps there's a specific Chinese problem again. We'll hear from our Chinese colleague about this, a production problem, and of course China plays a major role in the world. So all of that was before the war in Ukraine, and of course we observed that inflation was going up in Europe, in the United States, in advanced countries before the war. Now the war, of course, accelerated all of that, prices, agricultural production. There was a loss of trust at worldwide level, which was very serious. And of course, that led to inflation. And then I can add that Europe, unfortunately, it was especially struck. Europe is the weakest link. Europe it depended most on supplies from Russia. So Europe is there in the center of the war. And comparing the United States and Europe, we mustn't forget that we have been more impacted than the United States. So I think I've taken up my time. Yes, you've even used up a bit of the time of the next speaker, but thank you very much for answering that question. So same question for you. Yes, thank you, Beatrice. I'm going to start by saying that I'm not happy about the title. I want to break inflation. I come from a country, Brazil. Our memory is much more recent than the memory of Europeans with respect to the inflation processes. So it makes it reduces salaries. It has an impact on future investments. It disrupts a whole lot of growth factors and distribution factors in the economy. So it's not managing inflation; it's breaking things. But the good news is, and I really believe in President Trichet's analysis, we've got the right tools. We've got central banks, and we can debate about the fact, you know, with the different paces, whether we're behind or ahead. But I think we have to trust the technology that we have. We've got our monetary policy, the analyses that we have, and the political leaders and decision makers we have, because it's not simple. Myself, as you know, President Trichet, President Trichet, you're a good example of this. There's the timing of the monetary policy. It's something that's quite complex because we have to break inflation, but as Jean-Pierre was saying at the beginning, we have to do this while at the same time maximizing opportunities, so that if you're breaking inflation, you do this in the most favorable manner possible for activity. It's not easy, but it's about transmitting sector-based shocks, sharing them across the economy. That's what triggers the spiral, and that's what triggers the inflation process. Now, this, process where we're moving from something that didn't exist and we're moving into anticipation, that's something that we have to break so that we can manage the inflation process. It's not just a question for banks, it's everybody's problem. Inflation is the most regressive tax that may exist. Countries that have high inflation rates, like developing countries, they know this. And I will finish with a small observation about your remark about green inflation. So perhaps it's a paradox, but we had an adjustment, a relative price adjustment. I think it's Christine Lagarde who mentioned fossil inflation. So this already took place at a level that we no longer hoped would be possible with the carbon tax. We were expecting for Godot, and something happened that is perhaps, yes, that's something that has to be managed, I agree, but inflation has to be broken. But the alignment process, the incitation of this relative price change between the fossil and renewable, yes, we have to manage it in a virtuous manner in order to accelerate the energy transition. That's a very complicated question. I think we'll talk about this question in many other auditoriums, but I will hand over now to my colleagues. Thank you very much. Jean Bernardo. Yes, I looked at inflation from an historic point of view to see whether we were in the conditions and to look at things and see whether anything had been changed. All monetary stability periods have been followed by quite strong inflation. Jean II, who was a king of France, he created the franc, which was a reserve currency, and it weighed 2.7 grams. And it went together with an account and pounds, and there was a great defeat in Poitiers against the English. Now, the value of this pound, which became a franc later on, was divided by 150,720. So inflation, it's not just a phenomenon that is new. There are many historical periods of inflation. There are three causes. First of all is the inflow of settlement currencies. This is what we had in Spain of the 16th century with the gold and silver from you've got expenditure, state expenditure to finance wars. Now that's what we had in the 13th century. It's China as well, because there was the bank that was created. Then you had the Regency in France after the War of Secession in France, the two World Wars and the Vietnam War for the United States. And the third is the terrible drop in supply, like with the Great Plague of the 15th century, or the petrol crisis, the oil crisis. Now, these causes can all join together. And of course, as President Trichet says, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing an accumulation, and it's monetary creation that created fertile ground for inflation. The catalyst was COVID and the war in the Ukraine. Now, can we say, could we have said when it was going to happen? Well, not easy to say, because we knew that we had to observe the excess monetary creation. But when was it going to happen? It depends on behavior in terms of savings and demand. Paul Hermelin, same question for you. After what's been said, and without going back down history like Jean, let me just make 2 or 3 remarks. The first is that, well, we're heading towards an era. There are several types of inflation, and we can't use the same remedies. We won't succeed with that. Then we've got demand and supply, and as Jean-Claude says, we've got the COVID measures. Trump's COVID measures flooded the market, created demand, and so we had this excess of demand with respect to supply, and this increased prices. And that's only can be treated by compressing demand. So then you have external inflation, like with oil and raw materials. It's not quite the same thing. First of all, we have to underline that there was external de-inflation. Europe was virtuous for 10 years. We hadn't had any inflation. But low inflation was the sum of external de-inflation coming from globalization that was very dynamic, and then a certain internal inflation because of the mediocre competitiveness of services. So it's the balance that was at zero. Believing that we were virtuous everywhere across France or Europe, or that's just a mistake. So for a while now, we've lost the driver in terms of inflation. And then you had COVID with the freeze in international trade. But whatever the case, there was a refusal for de-inflation because of products coming from China. So getting rid of that driver, this de-inflation driver, meant that the balance was no longer zero. It became positive. So it's something that will have to be dealt with. And you mentioned, well, you told me to talk about sequences. You've got the question of oil. Some people are happy that with the Ukrainian crisis because it's brought fossil fuel prices up. Because of and that has an effect on carbon taxes. Now, I've heard from different company heads. As of April and May in 2020, right after the lockdown, they told me there are supply problems. Prices are going up, and we're not going to be able to keep on track. Now, central banks didn't really want to take that on board, but because there was this external de-inflation from globalization and the increase in prices of raw materials, this was independent of the Ukrainian question. So, Mr. Lin, can you hear me? We're very interested to know what your point of view is for the question.
Okay, very good. The good news is that inflation is not an issue in China, because we can see the CPI in China in the first quarter this year was 1.5%. And in April, 2.1%, May, 2.1% again. Most likely, the second quarter, the inflation rate in China is likely to be 2.1%. And for the third quarter this year, the projection was 2.6%. The fourth quarter this year, it was 2.3%, the forecast. And for the whole year, the inflation rate is likely to be 2.1%, extremely low. And not only the inflation rate in China is low, China is contributing to the mitigation of high inflation in EU, in US, and other countries. Because production in China is not much affected by the COVID-19. And so the production continued. And when other country was hit by high inflation, that means the demand in those countries are larger than the supply. And China can export to fill the gap. And it was demonstrated last year. The trade surplus from China was 676 $676 billion US dollars, about 3.8% of China's GDP. And in the first 5 months of this year, the trade surplus of China was 300 billion US dollars. So China export more to the global markets than import from the global market. And those net export certainly were contributing to the lowering down of the inflation rate. So that means what? Without China's export, the inflation rate in EU and in the United States, which would be much higher than what we observe now. And looking ahead, next year and beyond, China is likely to maintain low inflation rate because the inflation rate in China since 2012 has only been between 1% and 2% every year. And the main reason for that was because the growth rate in China decelerated from more than 10% before 2011. Before 2011, the growth rate in China has been, around 10% or more every year. But since 2012, the growth rate in China has dropped down to now around 5 to 6%. That means there is large excess capacity in China due to the lowering down of the growth rate. And because of excess capacity in China, as long as there's excess demand in the global market, China can increase the production, increase the export, and those export will contributing to the mitigation of high inflation in other countries in the world. Let me stop here.
Merci beaucoup. Donc,
China is part of the solution. Now, is it part of the solution in medium term? I wanted to ask you the following question now. Jean-Claude Trichet, are we now, I mean, you provided a partial answer, but in a new world, in a durable way, higher inflation, higher than this kind of a current situation, which happened 20 years ago with the entry of the China into the World Trade Organization, or in view of what you mentioned, transition? Well, first, let me say that there was an interesting, important phenomenon at the time of the Lehman Brothers crisis. All central banks of developed countries gave themselves the same definition of price stability, that is 2%. It was the European Central Bank before. It was the case before, after correction from the Bank of England, and after Lehman Brothers, the US and Japan, in that order, adopted the same definition of price stability. All major central banks of advanced countries whose currency are in the special basket are the same definition of price stability. And in the current period, which is clear inflation-prone situation, the Fed confirmed that it will lower when it comes to the inflation anticipation. Inflation is around 2%. Indeed, the European Central Bank just said it quite strongly, and the other main central banks too. So clearly, the central banks now want to say we maintain our definition of price stability, as I said, or objective of price stability, as some of them say. Now, basically, I trust that we are not in a period of very high lasting inflation. I think we are going to go back to what I experienced myself. I could go to Berlin proudly and say, since the beginning of the euro, at the end of 2011, we've had a mean inflation of 1.97%, something like that. totally in line with our definition of price stability. I do trust central banks to give us in the medium term, long term, the price stability in line, in line with their commitments, which are public commitments. Of course, they're not alone, and we need that all other partners and players take into account the fact that we are in a world where the threat is more a threat of inflation in advanced countries and global, but not a threat or threat or risk of deflation. We've changed the nature of the threat, algebraically speaking, but I remain confident in our ability to preserve our price stability, which once again has a global definition and not just European. So eventually, Mr. Trichet says price stability is 2%. Why? Medium term. Why not 3, 3.5? Why even 4? Well, to answer, and I fully agree with President Trichet, when we look at the inflation anticipation 2024 for most of the major monetary zones, we converge around 2%, which is the objective of price stability. Therefore, central banks trusted we trust central banks to do their job. You know, they're convinced that this work will be done. This is great news, and it is also progress that have been made in the targeting the independence of central banks, when they were able to create the great moderation. Don't forget, we went to for about 30 years in inflation, low inflation, which created growth and well-being. So clearly there is a whole set of good news. And as I was saying, I think that central banks are able to break inflation today. But I believe that it is also true that there are risk factors. President Trichet early on talked about the fact that the objective of carbon zero, net zero carbon in our economies, which is a major objective. We all noting the effect of global change. Well, this will call for technological investment for a certain amount. Actually, as we know, this investment will be huge. I mean, well, we don't have to see this not as a disaster, but in a Schumpeterian approach. In the rencontre, we got Philippe Tréjean, who will talk about virtuous growth, and Jean-Claude talked about. So what are the means to be mobilized to ensure transition will take place towards a low-cost renewable energy transition? This is to be examined. This is, in terms of inflation, it will increase. So, but when it comes to the change of the geography of globalization, so we'll have to do, we look at the cost of with the new geography of different geography of globalization, and this will have an impact on cost, of course. And another point that we have to acknowledge, what Jean-Paul talked about earlier, the redistributive conflict. But it's not just in Europe. I mean, we realize very well that if we pay attention to our representative democracies, if we are able to analyze the fact there is a fact between redistributive conflict and the rise of populism, well, we have to question the fact that at one given stage, we will have to think together, conjointly, and achieve a consensus about the way today salaries, wealth is shared, profits and salaries. So it's quite compatible with growth, better productivity, but will make it possible to relieve a bit what is an underlying cause of the transmission of cost towards inflation, which is the tension of redistributive conflicts that in the third world and in different countries we know very well. And I think today we are re-experiencing in a stronger way in advanced countries, but we have to think about it, and we need to find a solution which is socially just and which will achieve a political consensus. Did we enter a new world? Well, I think to look at the topic, we have to look at the production factors and monetary policy. I'm not as pessimistic as my co-panelist as to the structural factors, because I see three that drive inflation up and three that push inflation down. The three up: energy, cost of energy, especially with energy transition, the increase of expenditures of safety, homeland security, diverse regulation, which structurally will increase the operating cost of the economy. And there is also an arbitration in many domains of the economy, more in favor of margin than volume, versus what happened in the past. It started before COVID, it was pushed by the shortages, and it will last a while. However, on the contrary, the shock, the raw material shock, are always followed by counter shock, regardless of the material and the period. The cost of raw material always end up dropping. The internet distribution, the economy, you know, the fight against inflation, internet contributes to that. And you know, there is a factor of inflation. Even if we got a problem, we understand sometimes that this new economy contributes to that. So depending on the monetary policy, as that was said, and in fact, the monetary zones which do not manage inflation pay it rapidly, you know, pay the cost with exchange rate, as we see between the dollar and the yen. Now, the economists do talk a lot about cost salary loop. Is this something to be feared, to be anticipated on, or organized? No, a lot of managers talk about that. I believe that it is the topic of summer 2022, because as of the, you know, in September, this will be the key agenda, and the loop or salary adjustment loop will be considered as of September. First thing, let's not ignore. We should not ignore the result of the two elections we've experienced, and this will lead us to a rather confused or unclear political situation, and we have a very combative left leader, and we have to consider this could generate from the French government, you know, they would want to appease strikes through increased salary, and businesses would say, instead of going through strikes that are going to be harsh or hard, well, let's readjust salaries. I'm talking about NAO 23, you know, mandatory annual negotiation, that would 23, which would be anticipated in summer 22. This is the outcome of those election cycles, and we have to bear that in mind. This is very specific to France. Is it serious? Well, if it leads to a permanent cycle, it is serious. But we are at the critical point. Now, two other comments. We did talk about the combination between salaries and you know, the great resignation wave. You know, I'm in the domain of technology, consulting. We were actually impacted by that, but according to the young people, we apply usually young employees. You know, usually mean age is 31. People talk mainly about the meaning, and following the crisis of COVID and the existential shock they got, they want a job that has a social meaning, in terms of societal meaning, in terms of climate, diversity, inclusion. So meaning and flexibility from the young employees. I don't hear about inflation or cost adjustment, and that they want sense and flexibility. The other point I want to mention is about salaries, and this is the topic of the fall. Well, the government will increase public expenditure. You know, 20 million euros for the purchasing power. What's the ability of public authority of the nation? Whatever the cost, you know, what will it be? 22, 23, 24. Public expenditures will limit pressure on salaries, but this will have a cost, an impact on the debt that you know, could be scary in itself. So the third point I want to mention, and I'm referring you to to something mentioned by Jean-Claude Trichet and by Mr. Pereira on the income policy and expenditures. Well, I do happen to be a young dinosaur. I'm a young dinosaur because I was in Jacques Delors' team in 1981 and 85. The key to prevent price-salary linkage, it was to project ourselves forward, because if we try to solve it's called scala mobile in Italy, you know, the mobile scale that exists in Belgium still. You solve the past inflation, and the business managers try to impact it on price, and the merry-go-round goes for another spin. So Jacques Delors' talent, not to ignore it, was to have, well, to get to a situation where political power, managers and trade unions, you know, could actually commit themselves. There was an advertising spot, if Jean-Claude remembers, with a selling board, and the France was behind with a selling board where there were the figure 13, because we had 13% inflation, and there was a race, you know, and we had recurrent. And so the anticipation was to go to 8. The inflation objective was to go from 13 to 8% by managing an agreement between employer and employees to go to 8, and then 5, and then 3. Now, in order to pull out of the price-salary cycle, we have to shift to anticipation, looking forward. If you're not looking forward, you'll never make it. There you go. So this is exactly the situation we face, because if indeed central banks are able to anchor anticipations into a 2% convergence in 2024, it is quite possible to recreate the virtuous condition you mentioned, that is the ability to have a coordination between central bank policies, monetary policy, budgetary policy, and the way anticipation for inflation will be anticipated to lower with businesses. I'm not saying it's something simple to do. It is highly complicated, but it was done. Another experience of Israel and Michael Brunel, the governor of Israel central banks in the 90s, with inflation which was much higher than the European one today. The tripartite agreement between unions, trade unions, private business and government were able to create actually this green virtuous trajectory of the drop of inflation through permanent anticipation. Beatrice, if you don't mind, then we'll give the floor to Beijing, to Mr. So do I remember it? Of course I do remember the Delors period and the a priori indexation and not a posteriori, but also the fact that this very concept called competitive disinflation was continued by France for 17 years with several successive governments of different views. And the success was brilliant. There would be no euro. We wouldn't talk about the euro if we had not had this multi-party policy for 17 years. Mr. Lin, can you hear us?
Oui. Vous nous avez dit en
Yes,
présentation.
I can hear part of your argument, but sometimes it was silenced, so I cannot keep track all the argument from my side.
Ah. Vous nous avez dit en préambule que
For
l'inflation, c'est
example, I
pas un
cannot hear
problème.
you now.
Can you hear me, sir? Can you hear the translation? Hello, can you hear me? No, I think there's no. Sir, can you hear me? Can you hear the translation, sir? Can you hear the translator talking to you now?
No voice, I cannot hear you.
Yep. Well, let's see if we can get the connection with China. So we started talking about some of the solutions. Well, what central banks can do, what states do, you know, the purchasing power law. Now, central power. Now, don't you think there could be a risk? In the Eurozone, we are 8. You said that the medium-term target is 2. Don't you think there is a risk of overreaction of interest rate that would cause precipitate or accelerate inflation? The fine-tuning of central banks will be complicated in the coming months. Of course, indeed, there are depressive and inflationist effects, and we have to take both into account in your medium-term perspective. Central banks are independent and they can reason in medium term. They commit themselves in medium term. So we can see clearly that in the US and in Europe, the provisory conclusion of central banks that I have to preserve my credibility. I said that I will achieve inflation around 2% in the medium term. I can prove that I'm credible by acting myself. And in the US, you saw that after having said there will be no inflation, we don't move. Now we going through the third inflation interest increase crisis. So Christine already said that we will get an increase. Many experts actually, waving the red flag and saying there will be inflation. Well, there could be a risk of recession, but they're not right to say it is caused by the monetary policy, because this monetary policy today is far more accommodating than before, because the nominal interest rate haven't moved yet. I mean, those of the central banks in Europe, whereas the real rates short term have dropped significantly with the inflation. So what counts for central banks today is to remain credible. If they lose their credibility, everything is gone, because we cannot anchor inflation anticipation, as what was said, and then reassert, because we are in a turmoil, in a 8.6% inflation, red line in Europe and in the US. I'm not talking about the core inflation, which is in the US it's at 6%, and for us it's 4.6%. So in both cases, if you want, there is urgency. Central banks are right to say that we act on our side, and I believe that they are absolutely right to say, careful, we are not alone. We're not alone, and the second round effect could be essential. For example, they could be tragically anticipated by the social partners and the governments, or even the parliaments, or they can be denounced as being threats in medium term. Now, if we lose the control of inflation, we know what we're going to get, because we saw in the US what it means to break inflation when in a high advanced country, Paul Volcker comes back to monetary power and commits necessary action, but quite dramatic, with interest rate at 14, 15, 17%. We don't want that. We don't want that. And this is why the US and the Fed and the Europeans and the European Central Bank are right to say, don't forget us, we're here and we act. And we act without listening to the good advice of those who said, do not move. If they are not helped in the two sides of the Atlantic by the governments and the social partners, and then we'll face a very, very bleak situation. Mr. Da Silva, how high could the interest rate rise? I think President Trichet summarized the situation. You don't want to enter in a high inflation zone that would be permanent, that would spread to the entire economy. Let me give you another Brazilian anecdote. In a high inflation period in Brazil, if you wanted to go from one point to another, you pay the taxi the arrival and not at the start, like the bus when you have to pay at the start. So when you go low income and distribution of income, so action of central banks, of course, and action and as long as necessary. The dosing problem are technical problems. Central banks are quite equipped to calibrate their monetary policies as a function of the offer and supply, demand and supply condition. They have a great experience in this domain. They have the tools, appropriate tools, and they do, and I think President Trichet is quite right, they must have two independent ways in their role, but they have to rely on other players. And when the recession problems will occur, we'll be able to trigger compensatory policies for more vulnerable groups, unemployed people and low-income revenue.
Yes, Jean Bernardo. Yes, I would just add a point. The central banks don't just have rates; they have the message, and That has already changed the paradigm, the monetary paradigm. First of all, they've broken the perception that the markets had, that the monetary policy had deleted the moral aspects and the excessive leveraging. And they've talked about the dynamic of permanent growth and the price of assets, which is a factor that's promoted by very low interest rates. So this new paradigm is less financial. It reorientates part of the forces of the economy, more innovation, work and productivity. All of that must allow us to find a path without bringing the rates up too high, a way of managing inflation without breaking growth entirely. So we heard about the central banks, but what about states? What's their role? We've heard about prices being blocked. We've heard about VAT being decreased. In France yesterday, there was a law on purchasing power that was announced with a policy for protecting people against inflation. What about the state's response? How can it be calibrated? What about the risks? So you've talked about different paths there, different problems. There's a first point that we have to be wary of. It's something that needs to be explained, especially in French, and that is the pernicious effects of price blocking. That leads to terrible inefficiencies in the economic system. This doesn't mean to say that we can't ask people in energy to make an effort with prices. But if the state starts to regulate prices, then it is powerless be in front of production here. It leads to de-optimization of the economy. There are the political forces talking about this. We need to all be clear that signal is an essential signal for optimizing the economy. There are effects that have to be compensated in different ways. We've talked about fuels, but the idea of a complete blockage is the wrong idea. And the second remark that I'd like to make, the compensations, with the idea that states are trying to target instead of sharing out, and we think about the underprivileged, we need to give money to the underprivileged. This is perhaps what states do in a very national context. There's no agreement, no concert. I don't know what the European Council is doing. Do people share the data of their programs for preserving purchasing power? It's almost as if the European Union doesn't exist, but we have a monetary union. Nobody compares what's happening in Germany or Sweden, the Netherlands, France, Italy, Spain. And so there is, the states have a role to play, especially when it comes to the underprivileged. And this is what you're underlying. Inflation is a tax for the underprivileged. And so there is room for the states to act. There's also a need for talking about it, agreeing about things. We need some kind of benchmark. And I'll finish with what Jean Bernardo was saying earlier on. There's a point which is really the key to the exit. We mustn't interrupt productivity. The risk is far, even if the rates are going up, the real rates are still negative, but we mustn't cut investment or cut productivity. We talked about Schumpeter, we've talked about innovation. The exit path is to focus on innovation in European economies so that we're making the right decisions, so that we're not just focusing on purchasing power and demand and sacrificing future programs on integrated circuits or the hydrogen program. We need to find the right balance between future investments and defensive measures, and notably for the benefit of the most underprivileged. So somebody is looking at me. We're already over time. So our speakers will be staying here, but we really must leave the stage now. So you can ask the speakers later. Maybe, Jean-Paul, you can give us a 15-second conclusion. Yes, 15 seconds. Okay. So the first session. So I agree with Louise. We shouldn't have called it managing inflation, but controlling inflation, rather than breaking inflation, But you want your breaking. Oh, well, too bad. So breaking inflation. The second thing is that central banks, as well as income policies, should help us with this task. And there's something else that Mr. Bernardo talked about. It's true that the best solution is really to have a higher growth cycle. That's the only way in which we will be able to agree about the way to break inflation. Thank you very much.
Parle, d'accord?
Oui.
Et tu veux faire un aparté. Tu traduis l'anglais.
Bonjour.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here for this session entitled Restoring Industrial Sovereignty. So this is a question that comes back again and again, but today the context is new. And that's because there are environmental constraints that are imposing changes in our prediction modes, in our consumption modes. There is the climate emergency, which requires fast decisions, and the international order from the Second World War is obsolete. And we are seeing a new organization. So restoring industrial sovereignty means that we first have to recognize the ability of the state to define and implement an industrial policy so that independence with respect to the rest of the world doesn't endanger the rest of our society. This industrial policy does not consist in helping companies with disparate actions. It consists in defining a strategy and the best vectors for transmission for implementing it. This also means that it's important to recognize the legitimacy of the state, its ability to draw up an industrial policy, in other words, recognizing the necessity to regulate markets. So this point reflects a general feeling. It was today, but it wasn't the case yesterday, especially when it came to our trade partners. Now, this legitimacy, and I'd like to underline this, I think it's very important. This legitimacy also means that the state needs to assess the results of its policies. It needs to assess the use of public money. Now, this public money, has it allowed us to achieve the objectives? Have actions been carried out in an efficient manner? Do we need to keep the same actions, the same transmission vectors, or must we modify them? This industrial policy, is it directly for companies? What about other transmission vectors? I think that this assessment, this evaluation of public money and industrial policy is absolutely essential. And in France, we have plenty of expertise in this field. Finally, when we're talking about industrial policy, we think about industrial sovereignty. But complete autonomy is neither possible nor desirable. And it's inevitable that we need to define cooperation strategies. Now, this strategies and this sovereignty, it needs to focus on Europe. The scope needs to be European, and we also need to think about cultural proximity and a community of interests leading to allegiance to powers. This strategy must also take into account new realities of emerging countries and developing countries that have changed a lot. And we need to integrate them into our policies so that we can adapt our production policies to environmental changes. Now, all of these questions will be explored during the conference by the people here on the stage. There will be 2 people following us remotely. And so that we don't waste any time, because we have very little time, I'm going to give the microphone straight away to Patrice Moreau. He's president of PwC France and the Maghreb. So you have the floor. Thank you very much. Now, first of all, I think you underlined it already, the COVID crisis, the war in Ukraine, unfortunately, and many other events have shed light on the need for sovereignty and supply safety. We carried out a study that was published in May 2022, so not very long ago. And in the study, we analyzed the different trajectories, the different paths for 2030. And what we saw was that restoring our industrial sovereignty came across different problems, rather a number of contradictions. First of all, it involves massive investment. This has to be recognized. 100 billion, 30 billion. Out of the 130, there are 30 billion for productive investments, and that's quite considerable. But in spite of that, when we looked at our models, we studied our scenarios, we realized that that investment would allow us to go from 10%, so that's the weight of industry in our GDP would go from 10% to 12% and 16%. So it's very important, but it's not enough. It's substantial, but not enough. And you know, that's a reflection of our history. You know, we've neglected industry. The second contradiction is the triptych. We don't talk enough about land and what is lacking in terms of land. And to restore industrial sovereignty, well, we'll have to build factories, but we have to have land to build factories on. We know that it will take a lot of time. It will take 4 to 5 years to qualify land as something that can be used. And then you have the resilience, the resilient climate, the climate resilience law that limits a certain number of things. And then we have training, skills. There are 70,000 jobs to be filled in industry, and to satisfy these challenges and this ambition, we need to train an awful lot of people because we don't have enough expertise, we don't have enough skills, and we won't have them between now and 2030. And then you've got the availability of financing to be taken into account today, as well as the 30 billion. We need 70 billion from private investment in order to reach the 12% and create 430,000 jobs. And so we need financing for all of that. And then finally, the last contradiction, the last thing that's important is social acceptability. What does that mean, social acceptability? It means that today, unfortunately, industry in our countries sometimes has a negative image. Our country doesn't realize how it's evolved. We've moved up to 4.0, Industry 4.0. So why is that contradictory? Well, everybody agrees that it's important that we have more industry, that we need to restore our industrial sovereignty. But at the same time, do we agree to reopen mines of rare earths? Because we know that we're going to be needing those rare earths. Do we all agree that at the end of the street, and I'm caricaturing rather, we need chemical industries, chemical factories that open? So I think, we've got all of these contradictions. We have to make societal choices that are important. And I think probably we need to talk about them more, because these choices concern absolutely everybody. I think that it's extremely important for us to restore our industrial sovereignty, and perhaps we'll talk about a number of proposals and solutions during the debate. Thank you very much for keeping to the timing there. So I'm now going to hand the microphone over to Mr. Tidjane Thiam, who should be with us normally. Yes, I am here. Yes, hello. We can hear you very well, Mr. Thiam. You're Executive President of the Freedom Acquisition Corporation, and you have the floor. Thank you very much. I hope that everybody will be able to follow what I'm going to say, and I'm sorry that I'm not in X with you. So I would like to talk about the context that we have. There's the structural aspect of globalization. There are the negative aspects. But then we have the economic climate and the COVID crisis. There's the war in the Ukraine. I'd just like to spend 2 or 3 minutes on the question of the supply chain, because it's important. So before COVID, we were focused on efficiency, and we were focused on resilience. So that in the 90s, we focused on efficiency, and in 2000s, we had another model. I'm sorry, but the sound keeps cutting off.
the origin of the products which came from all over the world. Well, you know, we actually enjoyed low cost. The complex supply chains had a major impact before the COVID crisis. What happened is that after that, we're sorry, but the quality of the transmission does not allow for translation. Very sorry, sir. Even though the model allows for having low cost, but there are also high. Well, we've seen, for example, in the automotive industry, for example, there is the. No, sorry, I'm sorry. We're doing our best, but we cannot hear the speaker. Very sorry.
Si vous prenez les 3000 premières entreprises mondiales, leurs stocks sont passés de 6% du PIB mondial à environ 9%. C'est énorme, c'est une augmentation de 50% des stocks pour se prémunir contre les pénuries et l'inflation. Donc on a à peu près 9 000 milliards de dollars aujourd'hui de stocks accumulés dans l'économie mondiale. Alors moi, ce que je veux dire là-dessus, c'est simplement que cette transition d'une extrême efficience vers de sécurité et de résilience est nécessaire, mais elle doit se faire avec raison, avec modération et avec discernement. Et pour moi, le pire serait qu'on aboutisse à un cocktail de protectionnisme et de subvention dont tout le monde pâtirait. Parce qu'à terme, et ça on oublie toujours, tout ce système d'ailleurs qui paye, à terme c'est le consommateur qui paie à travers des prix plus élevés. Et ça risque de poser des problèmes. On a bien vu la sensibilité du consommateur à l'inflation. Et par ailleurs, ça va vraiment dans le mauvais sens. On a aujourd'hui 25 millions de tonnes de céréales qui sont prises en Ukraine, et la plupart des pays sont en train de prendre des mesures qui, au lieu d'atténuer le problème, nous rendent encore plus aigus. L'Inde vient d'annoncer qu'elle bloque les exportations de blé. Il y a un certain nombre de pays qui actuellement bloquent l'exportation des engrais. Ce dont on a besoin, c'est plus de production agricole, pas moins de production. On sait qu'il y a une très forte élasticité des prix des productions agricoles. Il ne faut pas bloquer les prix des produits, parce que cela découragerait la production et va rendre les problèmes encore plus aigus. Donc je crois qu'il faut faire très attention dans ce contexte à des solutions qui sont des solutions qui paraissent être de bon sens, mais qui risquent à terme de se retourner contre même les catégories qu'on peut protéger. Donc il faut que les décideurs, les chefs d'entreprise se montrent raisonnables et qu'on puisse sortir par le haut à ce contexte avec une économie qui puisse garder certains des avantages.
Excusez-moi,
en devenant plus résiliente. Et je veux juste faire un commentaire, parce que je pense qu'on ne se demande pas assez pourquoi on a pu avoir pendant aussi longtemps des taux d'intérêt bas et peu d'inflation, et ça se mesure. Il y a eu une déflation mondiale induite par la Chine. Là, on voit que quand la Chine arrive en fin de course des gains de productivité qu'elle peut fournir à l'économie mondiale, soudain, l'inflation revient. C'est tout facteur. Mais la Chine a contribué à une élévation de l'économie globale et à une élévation du pouvoir d'achat à travers cette déflation par les coûts. Donc finalement, juste pour conclure, parce qu'on a un temps limité, mais je voudrais juste finir en disant que pour moi, la vraie souveraineté, c'est celle des idées. Que la souveraineté, elle découle de la capacité à produire des biens et des services que le reste du monde désire. Et ça, c'est incontournable. Et que donc, la souveraineté, un pays n'a autant de souveraineté qu'il a de capacité d'innover et de créer. Pendant longtemps, on a dit que la Chine savait produire mais pas innover. On voit aujourd'hui avec Alibaba qui est partout, encore TikTok, quelle que soit la valeur qu'on attribue à tout ça, qu'elle est absolument capable d'innover. Et donc, je crois, et pour finir, que si la France veut recouvrer la souveraineté industrielle, elle doit le faire en innovant avant tout, peut-être aussi en légiférant, mais pas en interdisant, et en innovant et en investissant dans la créativité. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup. Je vous redonne.
Thank you very much. I'll give you the microphone later on, but if possible, can I ask you to stay at the same distance from your microphone because you keep cutting off. I'm now going to hand over to Mr. Cyril Garcia, who is the director of Gemini Invades. Yes, hello, can everybody hear me? Perfect. So that's a superb subject. It's been the subject of many publications, price studies, a very interesting book by Nicolas Dufour published a few weeks ago. So the role of states, it's the battle of intelligent industry. That's the core subject. That's the battle that has to be won in the 5 coming years. And there are 2 objectives. The first is sovereignty. And sovereignty is a content creating jobs on national territories and elsewhere. And the second dimension is strategies. It's based on strategies, being compliant and following strategies, low carbon, whether they're national or European strategies. So those are the two main objects, sovereignties and low carbon. And there are three fronts. The first is the smart industry front. We need intelligent, smart technologies. The second front is circularity. That's vital for all of us. And the third front is a word that's coming back into fashion, and that is planning. So nobody's telling me to stop, so I'll continue. So in terms of smart industry, we've got platforms, we've got 3D platforms, digital platforms, we've got digital twins to optimize the use of natural resources and preserve our land. We know the impact of our production, so we can anticipate, we can think ahead and improve the situation. So that's one aspect of intelligence. The other aspect that is coming to the fore is that we have to think about the end of product life cycles. We need to go beyond the triptych extract, produce, use, throw away. So there are several stakeholders across the world involved in that. We need to think about sustainable products, products that last. This has been a wish for a long time, but now it's becoming an operational and technological possibility. And behind that, you've got the second front, and that is the front that involves circularity. So this is an essential response, an essential solution when it comes to the sovereignty debate. It allows us not only to control our resources. Patrice was talking about the question of land. But, you know, we're not just going to look for new land. We're going to use existing land. So we need to control our resources. We need to master them. And we need to reduce our dependency. It's all well and good. You know, we'll talk about industry of the future, solar panels, solar farms, battery gigafactories, catalyzers, methane producers. All of that is fueled by cobalt, lithium, nickel, copper, which are rare materials, and they're vital components for our industrial future and for our jobs of the future. And if I may, I declare that the circular economy is an emergency. It's right at the heart of all of these industrial challenges. And we haven't got 20 years ahead of us. We've got 5 years ahead of us. And then let's talk about planning. We can talk about clean tech. We need to make sure that our industries and economies become greener, hopefully before 2050. We know we've identified things. There are many studies on the 50, 60 technologies classified per industry, per field of innovation. There are gigafactories, carbon capture, smart grids. They all have an impact in terms of reducing emissions, but they also have an impact in terms of creating jobs. All of that's been measured, it's been published, everybody knows about it. What is urgent is anticipation. It's about thinking ahead, planning, and especially financial planning. The first step, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's happening now. In other words, we've got seed funding. In France, there's a huge movement based on seed funding in this country and at European level. But we need to scale things up. We need to scale things up. This needs to be supported. And the third point concerns the protection of industrial property and the fact that in our country we've got standards. We can't go back to artificial intelligence and cloud battles. We train great engineers who are very well versed in all of these subjects, and they have to be protected. And that's the real subject. That's what's urgent. We've got to implement planning. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand the floor to Mr. Yu Yong Ding, who is an economist at the Academy of Social Sciences in Peking. Normally, he is connected. Yes, can you hear us? Yes, hello, Yu Yong Ding. Can you hear us? It's a pleasure to see you again. Unfortunately, you're not with us. So you have the floor for 5 minutes.
I would like to utilize this opportunity to share some of China's experience in industrial policy. Industrial policy was very fashionable in 1980s and 1990s in China. On the one hand, China wished to participate deeply into international division of labor, FDI and trade to allow comparative advantage to have a full play. On the other hand, China wished to establish a comprehensive industry which includes all vital sectors in the modern economy and can guarantee China's independence and security. To achieve the objective, the focus of China's industry policy in 80s and 90s was to attract FDI and promote localization of parts and components of final products to achieve a sort of import substitution. The involvement of China's car industry is a case in point. In 2000, industrial policy became a controversial topic. The mainstream thinking was quite negative about industrial policy. Many argued that industrial policy created market distortion and a waste of resources and should be abandoned. In the middle of the 2000s, because Chinese entrepreneurs increasingly felt that their foreign partners are reluctant to transfer technology to them, and China was in danger of being locked in the lower ladder of international division of labor. As a result, the concept of indigenous innovation and creation became fashionable. And later, the plan of Made in China 2025 was introduced by a group of entrepreneurs, industrialists, and technocrats at the Ministry of Industry and Information. To be honest, at the time, few, if any, has paid great attention to this plan. I was a member of the advisory committee of national planning and participated in the discussion of Made in China 2025 during a regular session of the committee. Very soon, I forgot the existence of the plan until the Trump administration made a great fuss about it. Trade war and the events that was unfolding later, such as sanctions against ZTC, the arrest of Madam Meng Wanzhou, and the blacklisting of hundreds of Chinese tech firms by U.S. government made public in China, reached a consensus that China needs industry policy, period. The only question is, what kind of industrial policy does China need? For a long time, Vice Premier Liu He emphasized the difference between horizontal industrial policy and selective industrial policy. He was in favor of horizontal industrial policy, but industrial policy has become quite selective recently in China. The targets of industrial policy are mostly aimed at specific products. For example, as target, the government has selected 16 projects, such as jumbo jets, semiconductor integrated circuits, electric cars, and so on. But horizontal industrial policy is still important in China. Experience shows that to identify the right target is not that easy. How to strike a balance between horizontal and selected industrial policies is still a problem, needs to be solved. China's industrial policy instruments include government procurement, product standards, localization requirements, product subsidies, tax incentive, investment promotion agencies, special economic zones, incubator program, and so on. But two stand out: direct subsidies to firms and below market credit to some enterprises, not necessarily COEs. Although at this moment, industrial policy is no longer a controversial issue in China, how to formulate and implement an industrial policy is still a huge challenge. There are two contradictions stand out. First, how to reconcile the conflicts between security and efficiency. In other words, on the one hand, China wishes to continue to participate in global supply chains. On the other hand, China also needs to minimize the negative impact of interruption of global supply chains due to various causes, including geopolitical causes. Second, how to encourage local governments continue to play the vital role in implementing industrial policy in terms of a selection of projects in line with the central government's guideline and raise money to finance the projects while avoiding excessive competition and waste resources. A list of challenges on how to formulate and implement industrial policy is long, but let me stop here. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci. Je donne la parole.
I will now give the floor to Mr. Shelby, former Minister of Industry in Tunisia and currently a banker. Sorry, I cannot hear you. Thank you, Mrs. Chairperson. So following the COVID and the Ukraine war, European countries tried to reinforce their technological sovereignty, and especially by reshoring their industry, which concerns first Europe, of course, but possibly the proximity circle or the first circle. So question, what is the scope of this action? In the last Davos meeting in May, we talked about friendly shoring, that is to relocate in friendly territories to ensure safe supply. And its report 2022, the Foundation Prospective and Innovation talked about solidarity innovation. Each country should find a mix of sovereignty and cooperation, because integral sovereignty or autarky does not exist. So the report mentions the example of Tunisia by mentioning that the paracetamol produced in Tunisia is the same as the one produced in Asia. Now, just a couple of figures. Maghreb Industries exported in 2021 30 billion euros into the European Union, outside of the energy. This is quite a low figure because Chinese exports were like 10 times higher, 500 billion euros. But bear in mind that the 30 billion export from Maghreb generates about 300,000 jobs in Maghreb in terms of partnership, and will ensure long-lasting jobs in Europe as well. So we can say that one job created in the Maghreb will ensure the durability of one job in Europe, and I will give you examples later on. Now, you can object that all this is a lovely discourse that we in Maghreb have always been heralding, but the reality is that this rationale for partial proximity relocalization or re-offshoring is boasted by political and employment personalities in Europe. But with the increase of price in the former East European country, now today, trend has to be accelerated, a trend which was initiated several years ago to make it the European sort of back office. If only 10% of Chinese export to Europe, that is basically 10%, that is 50 billion euros, were relocated, it will be about the double of the Maghreb export into Europe. So therefore, it is quite a challenge. Bearing in mind that the Maghreb region as a autonomous partnership option as a spirit of Asia into Europe, and therefore these two types of partnerships are not conflictual. So it is the durability of the entire Euromed production system which is here at stake. Either Europe can counterbalance China and the US by widening its scope of proximity cooperation, or Europe will continue to lose its industrial fabric and its sovereignty. So what would be the role of the states in that process? What could be the role of states in? Well, countries in the north, states in the north and the south have to define industrial policies and cooperation that can meet the expectation of industries from the two shores, especially since these industrial policies are not necessarily rejected by those who wanted a factory-free economy or who thought there would be a post-industrial future that everybody seems to have forgotten now. When all this has been said, so Keynes already mentioned that the failure of the invisible hand of the market should be corrected by the visible hand of the state. Jean-Paul Fitoussi, who was Tunisian actually, who passed away this year, said that laissez-faire is a theoretical folly which is applied nowhere in the world as an economic policy. So let me say that the law of the market are indicators that we should not stray away from, or unless there will be a high distortion, and we must have ambitious industrial policies with the learnings from the past mistakes and the recognition of the role of the markets or their failures. Jacques de Band used to say, there is no industry without the positive discrimination measures to forward this factor, otherwise the opters will opt for importation. If we are to keep one measure for economic policy, that would be the one. Thank you. I will now give the floor to Barry Lin, Executive Director of Open Market Institute. Thank you.
Pour 5 minutes.
Thank you all. It's a great honor to be on this panel with this very distinguished set of people. And I apologize that I will speak in English. But it's either that or Spanish. So I'm going to start with a question. I mean, this is an industrial policy question. And it is, what is your plan? What's the plan of France? What's the plan of Europe when China invades Taiwan? And I will guarantee that you actually don't have a plan. And the United States also does not have a plan. And why is this? Is this warmongering? I think that given what's happened in the Ukraine, the idea that China may invade Taiwan is actually a reasonable question to ask now. And in fact, there's a lot of rumors coming out of my friends in the New York Times, among others, that there is a plan afoot for China to invade Taiwan. So what would happen if China invades Taiwan industrially? What would happen is pretty much every industrial system on which we depend in France, in Europe, in the United States, across Africa, across South America, all of these systems would come to a halt. They would shut down. They would stop because of the break in the flow of industrial goods, chemicals, electronics mainly. It would stop. That would be an industrial crash, unlike anything we've seen before. It would be a financial crash. You stop the flow of goods, you stop the flow of money. Industrial crash, financial crash. The day China moves on Taiwan, things come to a stop. So, now this is not the only threat that we face. Let's be clear. This is not something that is, China is not the only problem. I mean, we can imagine pandemics, we can imagine earthquakes, we can imagine many other events that actually create much bigger, events, disruptions that are just as large. Already, let's just be clear also, China's not necessarily the aggressor here. That's not what I'm saying. You could say Trump is the aggressor. One could say that Trump's attack on Huawei using a supply chain war was the first act in the coming war. So my first point today is that the status quo is unsustainable. It is unacceptable. It creates an unacceptable amount of risk. There is no way that we as rational actors can sit here and allow this situation to remain. A war on China on Taiwan or many other events could stop the industrial system tomorrow. So my second point is that we actually know what to do about this. It's pretty easy. We distribute industrial capacity. Why would a war between China and Taiwan or any of these other events create such amazing disruptions? It's because there's so much concentration in capacity. 20 years ago, industrial capacity was spread all across the world. There were multiple factories to make every single thing that we needed. Now, in many cases, there's a single factory or a single industrial zone that makes everything that we depend on. Chemicals, electronics, we can go down the list. There was a revolution that was affected over the last 20, 25, 30 years. It was affected by the capitalists following the rules established by the neoliberal revolution of the 1980s and 1990s. That neoliberal revolution unleashed monopoly capitalism, and we've seen massive concentration. So we know what to do, and what we need to do is use competition policy, including trade policy, to distribute the capacity on which we rely. My third point is that we can start doing this now. We can start doing this in ways that have a transformative effect beginning in the next 2 years. We have all the knowledge that we need. We have all the technologies that we need. And we can do this in a way that actually promotes a more open and resilient system, that recreates an international system that actually works for all people, including in Africa and across Asia and across South America, not just for our friends, not just for democracies. We can do this in a way that keeps China in the system. We don't have to exclude China. China is not the aggressor. In many ways, the United States has been the aggressor. We can do this in ways that create freedom for the investors. And we can do this in ways that actually allow us to create the rules that allow us to start to begin to deal with the tech problem, Google, Facebook, and Amazon. Okay. And the last thing I'll say, this is my conclusion, is that the two countries that should be leading this effort are France and the United States in the next 2 years. This is how we do it.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Alors nous avons.
Thank you very much. We got a couple of minutes to open a discussion together about all those points and the proposals made. I would like first to talk to Mr. Patrice Moreau. You talked about the studies carried out, made on the studies. What are the proposals, the solutions that would result from the studies you mentioned earlier on? Well, if we want to talk, and what Barry said, if we want to talk about reindustrialization, lasting reindustrialization, this effort, massive effort that has been initiated, if we want this to yield fruit, and then we would end up with more industries, reduction of the trade deficit. Let's face it, maybe we'll have to, it will be balanced or zero. Well, three priorities are necessary, which I would like to mention. First is training and education. Clearly, we need a massive training to relocate high schools, technical schools in territories. They should be located in the territories versus the needs, vis-à-vis the needs, you know. There is low mobility, and we realize often the trainings or educations are not matching the needs of the territories. And also, we should involve all the businesses. Often we hear about this term, which is the full CSR corporation, but you know, it is for us to conduct this. It's not just the state alone. We, the business, have to do this, to train, retrain, you know, long life learning with our teams. It's, you know, continuous long life learning to get the proper skills. We need a second priority axis. We need industrial coalitions at the European level. Don't think that we can have a French leader alone, especially that would be counterproductive because others will want to emerge as well. You know, in hydrogen or electronic components and others, we need coalition, European coalitions. And let's mobilize the savings of the French. 5,000 billion savings in France. Let's create a new, you know, we could, you know, which is a non-risky asset or with low-risk assets, you know, we could have a new saving book, you know, to achieve this ambition. That's my vision. Now we can see in the discussion that the geopolitics takes a new scope, and the relationship with our partners in the world have evolved. Now, I'd like to ask the first question in this domain to Mr. Garcia. How do you see the evolution of relationship between France and its European partners? Well, they're closely linked because there are political and regulatory frameworks which are homogeneous and matching, so there will be, and it will be more so. But we need to define the proper objectives and move rapidly in short term, jobs, carbon control, strategic positioning with the clean techs and so on and so forth. Those are elements that are ahead of us, and we must move on fast. And when to react to what Patrice said, we must trust the French working bees that will, which will go to flowers and lead to innovation. So, we've got innovation by Dassault Systèmes, Schneider, Capgemini, Sopra, Steria, but those players do invest. They create all the jobs. This year, in France, we were going to create 9,000 jobs, including 3,000 in smart industry. That's pushing the lines, shifting the lines. I mean, I'm giving you French figures, but this will contribute to the advent and the acceleration of French European players. So there is the regulatory political agenda that is being organized, and then the action of the ecosystems and the small and the big ones. Thank you. As I was saying earlier on, when they were talking about industrial sovereignty, we could think that the most relevant perimeter would be France first, Europe second, but there is also the rest of the world. Now, I'm putting the question to Mr. Jéréby after your proposal. Could you give us a successful example of this cooperation between Europe and Maghreb, for example? During the COVID, several assembly lines in Europe, automotive assembly line in Europe, were able to compensate the lack of delivery from China with the production from Tunisia of Bahia, or textile factories in Tunisia modified their production line to supply masks in Europe during the COVID crisis. But examples are quite numerous of European companies which saved their factories in Europe, which were threatened thanks to cost perequation, which provide a global competitiveness between the two sides in the north and the south. Just for indication, 142 companies manufacture automotive components in Tunisia for Europe, and 81 companies which manufacture air industry component. The leader in cable bundle in the world is a Tunisian company which has 20% of the market. Just to give you another example, Tunisian company of filters for the automotive industry bought a company in Paris, which was a problem. The jobs were doubled in France 10 years later, thanks to the distribution of references. The less labor-intensive SKUs are now made in France. And finally, in the 4.0 industry, which is today a reality in Tunisia, several companies operate there, including a large French group specialized in smart networks, Internet of Things. And don't forget the energy domain, which is a very major cooperation framework, be it fossil energies with the Transmed gas pipeline between Algeria and Europe, and which is quite significant today, be it for renewable energies, also in renewable energy. Well, we should launch new projects like the Midterm Sun Power Plant. Now, I would like to mention my friend Eli Cohen, who used to say that we'd be tempted to welcome a industrial sovereignty strategy with one expression: at last, trouble begins. Though, good luck to all you all. We're somewhat running out of time, but I will mix the answers with the rooms and the talks of the speakers. A question maybe I will ask to Weiyongding. Can you hear me? So,
Qui est la suivante.
The question of the room is as follows. How could we find a balance? Could we envisage industrial sovereignty of developed countries to the detriment of the most fragile zone in a more trivial way? How to convince Chinese to buy Bordeaux wine and luxury handbags while reducing our trade? Can you tell us how we can convince Chinese people there? Did you get that, sir? Did you hear me? Did you hear the translation? Nope. Sorry, lost again. Someone could answer that? Oh, hello.
Question here. Sorry.
Oui, est-ce que la question...
Now, the question is, we want to reduce exchange with China, but China should keep buying our luxury goods. How can we do this? What do you say about that?
I think there should be no problem for China to buy in a very large quantity of products produced by European countries and by United States. Okay, I think it's very important for all countries to try their best to protect the global supply chain. I think that's very important. Even though China now is emphasizing importance of domestic demand, but China still pays great attention to the preservance of a global supply chain. So there's no policy change whatsoever. But here, I'd like to mention one thing, because Mr. Lin mentioned Taiwan. He said that China made Taiwan, attacked Taiwan. I think I should suggest him to read the Constitution still used by Taiwanese. To the Constitution, there's only one China. Taiwan is part of China. Mainland China is part of China. Okay, these two parts belong to one China. That's very important. There's no question about China invade Taiwan, attack Taiwan. People on the streets will solve their problem in a very amicable way. I believe that, because we have family members in Taiwan, and also there are lots of Taiwanese. They have relatives in mainland China. So I hope Ms. Lin will concentrate on how to protect global supply chain, worry less about so-called Chinese attack against Taiwan.
Merci.
Thank
merci.
you.
Merci. Peut-être une dernière question.
Maybe one last question asked by the room. What are the costs of industrial sovereignty and France and Europe? Are France and Europe ready to accept such a cost? Who wants to jump on that one? The cost of industrial sovereignty. Mr. Well, it's complicated. It's not in terms of cost. Well, we should reason in terms of investment and jobs. And to be honest about the impact and the content of jobs, you know, about circularity, about the technology package for tomorrow. The cost vis-à-vis what the previous periods cost us, you know, in terms of jobs. I mean, you know, we can see today the billions that are invested in clean techs and which feed those seeding funds. It's more an issue of strategy and execution than cost, as we are talking now. So there is also a question now: how can we make sure that the company will do innovation and develop innovative industries in France? Well, they have to survive and develop. We were in startup in the suburb of Aix-en-Provence and Grenoble in 1967. You know, it's a company that took its fate in destiny in hand, you know, in terms of innovation investment. I think what we expect from the state in Europe is a framework, a strategic framework that will give us coherence in what we do to create jobs and contribute to the net zero future. Thank you, Mr. Lin. I give you 1 minute to conclude, if you wish to add something to what's been said.
You know, I started off with a pretty harsh view of what is in our future. But there's an alternative, and the alternative is to face up to the magnitude of the threats that we face because of the industrial system that has been built over the last 25 years according to the rules of the monopolists. The rules of the monopolists have led to a system that is fragile and subject to catastrophic failure. It's a system that is run largely, if not entirely, on carbon. And it is a system that is breaking down in many ways before our eyes right now. we can, if we face this, rebuild a system right beginning today that allows us to achieve all of our fundamental political and economic goals. We have that capability. We have to recognize the problem honestly and do what is necessary, and we will build a world that's worth imagining today.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à Monsieur Yu Yongding et Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Yungding and Mr. Chichen Cham. Thank you all. Thank you all, and bye-bye.
Bonne continuation.
Bonjour à tous, merci d'être là nombreux malgré la chaleur ambiante. Alors nous allons entamer cette session, numérotée session 11, qui est consacrée au populisme et de façon plus large à l'articulation qui peut intervenir entre d'un côté les populismes sur le plan économique et puis les effets que l'on peut observer sur le plan politique et en particulier sous l'angle des menaces que ces politiques peuvent éventuellement laisser planer sur l'exercice de la démocratie. Alors, en tant que membre du Cercle des économistes, je vais proposer un certain nombre d'observations sur un plan relativement général. Mais auparavant, je voudrais présenter les participants à cette table ronde, à cette session. D'abord, Oya Ozarslan, qui est parmi nous, qui est juriste, spécialiste de questions de compliance, de gouvernance ou bien d'intégrité. Elle est inscrite au barreau d'Istanbul et de New York et elle siège au conseil d'administration de Transparency International, notamment de Transparency International Turquie. Ensuite, Diana Menem, qui est à mes côtés, qui est économiste, qui a travaillé dans le privé mais également au sein de plusieurs organisations internationales, notamment au sein du bureau des Nations Unies à Beyrouth. Et elle dirige aujourd'hui une ONG, Kuluna Irada, qui œuvre en faveur d'une réforme politique au Liban. Nous devions avoir également deux intervenants qui malheureusement n'ont pu se trouver parmi nous, en l'occurrence Roberto Gualtieri, qui est le maire de Rome, mais qui est bloqué à Rome par le Covid, et puis Andreas Georgen, qui est secrétaire d'État en Allemagne et qui lui est bloqué par des problèmes d'avion. Et enfin, en distanciel, nous aurons le plaisir d'écouter également parmi nous Hakim Ben Hamouda. Est-ce que tu nous entends, Hakim?
Yes, oui. Yes, but I'm more hearing the translation than your own speech.
Ok. Et qui, quant à lui, est économiste.
So Hakim is an economist. He has held various posts at the African Development Bank. He was Minister of the Economy and Finance in Tunisia, and today he presides a think tank, an independent think tank, at the Global Institute for Transitions in Tunis. So there we are. That's it. Though these people are the speakers for this session. So as I said, I would like to make a certain number of initial observations before handing over to our speakers. The first point, what is populism? It's not a political doctrine. It's not an economic theory. It's not even ideology. It's more of a rhetoric that instrumentalizes the feeling and the ill-being of populations. It's a political posture so that elections can be won. But it's also a posture that gives access to power and the implementation of a certain political strategies that are not necessarily homogeneous. They're more heterogeneous because there are left-hand populisms, right-hand populisms, there are macroeconomic populisms, and there are microeconomic populisms focused on protectionist policies, for example. However, there are invariables in populist policies, and let me cite some of these. First is the opposition between the people and the elite, or the denunciation of the distance established between different people. That consequently leads to the justification of redistribution policies at a large scale. Among other invariables, there's the objective to reconquer national sovereignty faced with the constraints limiting the action of nation-states because of globalization and because of threats coming from abroad. abroad, being understood in the large sense of the term, including imports, foreign companies and immigrants. Populism, it's also a refusal of a certain number of orthodoxies from a macroeconomic point of view, from a monetary point of view, and a budgetary point of view, or even with this idea of condemning the idea of free trade. So this is a brief overview of the outlines of different types of populism. Now, the second point, as a start to this subject, does economic populism work? What are the consequences of it? What are the effects of it? To know whether it works or not, we need to remember what the main measures are that are applied by populist leaders when they get to power. So, salaries are increased in the private and public sector. Monetary financing happens for covering budgetary deficit. These deficits then go up because of an increase in public expenditure. There's an increase in tax rates for rich people, but also for companies. There's a recourse to administrative measures to block prices. And there's also the implementation of protectionist policies. These are just some of the properties of populist economic policies, such as we saw before wars in many Latin American countries, such as we have seen also in the United Kingdom with Brexit, but also with the policy implemented by Donald Trump, that we can also observe, I believe, in Turkey today and in a certain number of other countries that may implement policies that are similar, that are connected to populism. Now, in many, many cases, and in almost all cases, in fact, after an improvement of purchasing power, employment, growth, it's these policies that are faced with high constraints, and then there are opposite effects rather than benefits. So hyperinflation often appears, and also there are bottlenecks when it comes to the supply and companies, and this leads to a great slowdown in economic activity or even crises. And according to the case, these experiences give rise to social unrest, major political changes in the democratic framework, but also to political regimes that are increasingly authoritarian, if not totalitarian. And consequently, that justifies the question that is going to be dealt with in this session, which is a contradiction between the implementation of these policies that we qualify as populist and then the durability of democracy in the countries where there is populism. So this is a very rough picture that I have painted, but I would like to conclude with two questions for our guest speakers, but also Hakim Ben Amoudou, who is in Tunis. So here's the first question. Should we reject economic policies that have been qualified as populist up until now? It's striking to observe that a certain number of aspects relating to these policies, to a certain extent, have been already implemented in industrial countries since we've had recurring crises. So the financial crisis that started in the United States, the COVID crisis, and then, of course, the repercussions of Russia's attack on Ukraine. So at the end of the day, non-conventional monetary policies, budgetary policies that are often qualified as whatever it costs. These are policies that are similar, to policies implemented in countries that are considered as populist. So there's the question. This experience that we have of populist economic policies, should it be rejected, given that usually they lead to failures, or is there anything that we can take on board, given the context of crisis that we are experiencing for many reasons that we've talked about since the beginning of the meeting. Now, Danny Rodrik, many of you probably know this person, an American economist, a Harvard professor from Turkey, opposed what he referred to as the good and bad populist policies. So good populist policies are the policies that tend try and compensate, offset the effects of inequality or unfairness resulting from globalization. Bad populism is when things go wrong, when democratic rules are questioned, when public freedoms are not respected. Can we differentiate between the two? Isn't there some form of determinism in political populism? Are we not necessarily attacking democracy with these populist policies? Other authors say the opposite. They say that to a certain extent there's a real level of determinism when this kind of policy is implemented, when failures begin to appear very quickly. There is a certain level of degenerescence. There's a deterioration in public freedom, and democracy is questioned. So these are some observations that I wanted to share with you in order to introduce the debate. And as of now, I'm going to hand over to Oya Ozarsalan, who's going to speak to you about her experience in Turkey.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm afraid I'm going to be speaking in English. And also, I'm afraid I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to be able to make economical analysis. But I'm going to be trying to touch the point of cultural and social aspects of populism. And maybe from the area that I'm working, anti-corruption. Maybe I can also talk about the relations, how corruption affects populism, and it's also affected by populism. And populism has risen all over the world recently, and it's consistently. And as we know that only in Europe, the parties that the populist parties have tripled their support in the last 2 decades. I mean, I guess it used to be sort of a phenomenon that is on the political infringe. But now, today, it's more like a mainstream development. And it's one of the significant developments in the world, shaping our world. What is populism, and what does populism to societies? Populism is basically a divisive rhetoric that pits people against elite. It actually divides societies into two, the people and the others. Or as a famous narrative, us and them, and it creates enemies in the societies. Whatever the type of the populism, I guess there are 3 main features inherent in populism types. First, it attacks and it hijacks the state apparatus. And then second, it increases the corruption and mass clientele. And then the third, it systematically suppresses civil society. So when I look at from this point of view, I can easily say that the populism is not actually beneficial to democracy at all. So I don't know. I mean, Danny Rodrik, he's Turkish and he's also living in the U.S. So I'm not going to be able to get into what good comes from populism and what's not. But maybe if there is only one thing that I can say about good in populism, it brings people to vote. It actually provokes people to vote more. And then it also increases awareness on certain issues like corruption. But for what goal? For what aim? I think that's the most important one. And you know, what happened to the society? What happened to our democracies around the world? And then, so how and why these liberal democracies, long-standing democracies, turn out to be the sort of regimes that also feeds into, you know, undemocratic impulses. You know, I think one of the significant factor is corruption, and I'm going to come to that. But maybe we should look at other factors, such as, you know, populism is indeed a bigger symptom of a bigger and structural problem. This is the deep-seated political, economical, and then the cultural grievances in societies. These are the issues that, you know, unaddressed grievances or inequalities or non-functioning politics, unworking institutions. These are actually the main areas that create populism around the world. And one of the significant factors is also corruption. Is high or rising corruption has found to be very useful tool for populists around the world. I mean, this is a paradox actually, because you know, the corruption is facilitating populism, but populism is also corruption, facilitating corruption as well. Populist leaders, they usually use the corruption as a very convenient tool, attacking against the established politics, constitutional democracy. But when they come into power, they, you know, unlike their promises, they perform very poor when addressing corruption. And on the contrary, they even weaken and worsen the whole system. Because they not only do not address the corruption, but they also target independent judiciary, free media, and also accountable institutions. You know, these are the main tools that we actually, when we address it, to fight against corruption. When we look at around the world, there are, you know, very different systems around the world, and then very dissimilar political system, but they seem like they are working, when they have the populist leader, they seem like they are working in the, you know, with the same mechanics and the same tools. I mean, remember that, you know, Donald Trump and, you know, Erdogan of Turkey, you know, when they were power, they actually appointed their next kin to very influential positions. So they actually work very similar tools. And when you look at it, they stir up national movements. For instance, in some countries, with the national resource countries like Venezuela, Kazakhstan, they pledge that they're going to protect the national resources. But when they come into power, they actually give grants to their clientele or kin or supporters of their system. So all in all, I say that, you know, corruption is one of the most moral underpinning when it comes to populism. What actually also does the populism into the society, it weakens accountable institutions. And when you don't have the accountable institutions, and when you don't have the separation of power, for instance, then your democracy is actually in retreat. Democracy is in trouble all around the world. And I mean, we're not only seeing it from our own experiences, but we also look at some, very known international organizations like Transparency International, Freedom House, Amnesty International, Reporters of Without Borders. And when we look at it, we see that, for instance, corruption is stagnating around the world for the last decade at least. And freedom of speech is under attack, and freedom of media as well. So it actually goes hand in hand with these populist regimes. And, and it's from Hungary to Turkey to Philippines to US, and it's actually emerging around the world. When it's emerging around the world, it enables grand corruption and it enables autocracy. So it's actually a very vicious cycle. What can we do about it, and is there any way that we can get rid of populism? But before going that, maybe I should try to answer one of your questions. Is there any good or bad populism? I'm not an economist once again, and I'm not going to get into those macro or microeconomic analysis. But what I can say is that when you have a populist leader in power, they usually tend to protect their supporters. So even if there is a left or right populism, whatever that is, in that specific country, they will try to tend to protect their supporters, and then the distribution of wealth in the society, and then the public resources actually could be unevenly given to their own supporters. So it is actually going to create much more deep polarization and also inequality in the world. So, I mean, to my view, even though if it's, left populism, as you see in the Latin America, which is basically that, in the left populism, they usually target, big corruptions or political elite against people, against the pure people, as they say. But at the end, it is going to also distort the economical factors and indicators. And I just like to conclude that if we are going to be able to, recover from populism, and in that sense, I actually would like to point out the role of the youth in society. Because when it comes to youth, I just like to point that democracy is actually making a choice. But in order to make a choice, you have to have the informed choice. You have to have the information, necessary information. Surveys indicate that young people around the world, they seem to be less interested in politics. And in one of the Eurobarometer surveys from 2015, it indicated that the young people, actually they're not interested in politics. They don't want to be a party member. They don't want to run. And so that's one of the dangers of the society. And secondly is that the young people, they are also less interested in news. They have totally different news consumptions from the older part of the society. They don't actually look at the media outlets. They mostly look at the social media. And the social media, I mean, it's supposed to be a democratic platform, but we see that, especially in authoritarian countries, there are army of trolls, going around the social media. And then there are very toxic feedbacks. There are ecosystems. There are bubble rooms. So it actually is not working for the favor of democracy. And in order to get rid of the danger of disengaged youth, I think we should create an ecosystem of information, the truthful information. What we need is actually democracy defenders. We need leaders from the public, from the youth, for instance, to reclaim the political arena for its citizens once again. We need stronger civil society to hold account to power. And we need actually, all the indication of democracy, because I mean, we cannot just drop the ball. We are living here, and we have to defend the democracy. And one of the main liberal values, basic values of the democracy, functioning institutions. So we have to find a way, the accountability, putting accountability on the table and putting functioning institutions on the table. So it's actually, it's on us, it's on the people. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, before giving you the floor, I would like to remind you that if you do have questions, please send us the question go to the website, so that for logistic reasons we'll be able to get all the questions, and we'll sensitize with that to our speakers. Diana, you have the floor.
Taking the time today. I'm trying to focus my intervention on an analysis of populist movements in Lebanon. Lebanon is not a democracy. It's a country in, hopefully, democratic transition. And it has been a country that has seen widespread populist movements, particularly after its post-war era. Actually, post-independence, but mostly in its post-war era. We're talking about 1990s onwards. And these were populist movements that were mainly political and not economic in nature, that focused mostly on identity politics, and that were sectarian-based. So they were movements that were based on the sectarian identity of the people that adhered to them. If you're a Christian Maronite, you'd adhere to a certain sectarian leader with a very strong discourse. If you were a Sunni Muslim, you'd adhere to another leader, and if you're a Shia Muslim, you'd adhere to a third. And the entire post-war period was basically a struggle between these populist and confessional discourse, and the sectarian leaders had a very powerful value proposition. I protect the sect, and I provide services. And amidst a deterioration and a complete deterioration of the state, access to services and protection, physical protection mainly, was key to the survival of these sectarian leaders. And really, movements were typical to populist movement. They were centered around a leader that was viewed to be strong, enlightened, etc., and that was supposed to be taking care of their own constituency. With those movements and with those discourses came the application of economic policies that were necessary, one, for these sectarian leaders who were sharing power in the state, to exploit the state, to make sure that they would perpetuate their power and their presence in the state, and at the same time for them to appease the masses. Two main tools were used. They were very powerful for a very long period of time. I'm talking here economically. The first was the stabilization of the exchange rate, so a peg against the US dollar. It has allowed the population to consume way above its means for a very long period of time. And at the same time, pumping of money, despite the incurrence of huge debt, into the public sector in order to inflate the public sector as much as possible and to use it as a tool to employ more and more people. It was a main channel of clientelism, actually. The public sector was a main channel of clientelism. Obviously, these this defected monetary policy that was not based on any rationale, on any balance of payment rationale, on any actually growth rationale, and at the same time, the policies, the fiscal policies that were also very aggressive and very much focused on expanding the public sector came to a bust. And we've witnessed this bust in 2019, and in a classical mode, we're seeing basically huge inflationary pressure, huge depreciation of the national currency, and very quickly, we're talking about an IMF program. And eventually, these policies that kept this political class sustained for a very long time were no longer doing the job, and they were faced with a reality. But also, something else happened in parallel, and it was very interesting. So people for the longest time in Lebanon were divided along sectarian lines. They vote along sectarian lines. They adhere to sectarian leaders, as I mentioned earlier. So, and also, as Oya explained, these populist discourses led to a real decrease in the levels of accountability. People never voted for a person based on whether they would get a road paved or get the right economic policies. They just voted for them because they represented, in terms of perception, right? They represented the interests of their own sectarian clan. But what happened in 2019 was extremely interesting because emerging political groups started regrouping adherents along new lines. And they were, yes, new populist lines, but they were lines that were based on the class struggle. So talk about the 99% versus the 1%. Talk about that the sectarian elite is capturing the state, and that regardless of your confession, if you belong to the 99%, this is where your struggle should be. So detach yourself from your sectarian leaders and come join a new type of struggle, which is a real struggle for socioeconomic rights. And this was a huge wave that came on the foot of the economic crisis and with what we call revolution, which is closer to like a huge uprising that started on October 17, 2019 in Lebanon. And for the first time, and the youth, yes, that were disengaged from politics for a very long time, found a new secular movement that at the same time was talking a socioeconomic discourse. And it was very interesting because 2 years later, 15 May 2022, the parliamentary elections came. And yes, this discourse sold. I mean, we didn't get sterile results. The system in Lebanon is very strong. You still have the sectarian leaders that are in power. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not really a democracy. This is a sectarian power-sharing system. The real power lies outside of the democratic institutions. We also have an armed militia that actually sets the pace of political engagement in the country. But what happened was that you have, for the first time, a new bloc that came into parliament that was non-sectarian, that was secular, and that for the first time was talking economics, public policies, and what benefits the people. But juxtapose this against the need for an IMF program, against the need for tightened monetary policy and a lot of fiscal constraints. And you are faced with a new dilemma. Will the new MPs or the new representatives of this movement be able to move from a populist discourse to more pragmatic policy making in the heart of institutions? And this is a real test. We're faced now with countless policy decisions in Lebanon. We've been trying to get an IMF program for the past 2.5 years with no success because the political class has been extremely resistant to the IMF program. We're faced now with new populist movements that are saying, listen, we need to spend more on social protection. We need actually to redistribute wealth. We need new taxation policies, but also with the real need for financing from an IMF program that's saying, you can't spend money that you don't have. And And this is a real test today to this movement, whether it will be sustainable or not, whether this discourse will be sustainable or not, is for us to see. But it's a new experience. There's so much at stake. And actually, even if the entire economic aspect goes to bust, what we will retain and what will be extremely valuable is that for the first time, the Lebanese are grouping along their interests as classes and not along their sects. And this is new and revolutionary.
Bien, merci beaucoup, Diana.
Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you. So I will now give the floor to Hakim Mouhamouda in Tunis. Can you hear us? Very well. You have the floor. Thank you, André. And this is one of the advantages of this pandemic, is that we are now able to use those hybrid meetings so we can be present physically or not. Anyway, André, I'm very happy to be with you, to take part in this event, which is essential and which is a great space for reflection in the French-speaking world. Unfortunately, I cannot be with you physically this year for professional reasons, but I do hope that next year, I will be with you. André, the theme, the picture you drew at the beginning is quite exhaustive, and I would like to add a couple of elements. Well, we have the same economic background. I heard our two colleagues, Olia and our colleague from Lebanon, with a lot of attention, and I would like to add small points in the picture you drew initially. I would like to talk about 3 points, important points. First, the interest economics pay to populism. I have to say it's very old interest, but not quite significant. Not large, significant enough for those who want the economists to get involved. The way economists think or ponder the question ponder on the populism, they should read the great book coordinated by André Cartavelis and published by the Cercle des Économistes, which is a remarkable book which fills a huge gap when it comes to the economic literature on populism, and especially in the French-speaking world. So, economists pay attention to this, but their center of investigation work was always Latin America, because Latin America was, historically speaking, as you said, André, the site of development of populism, economic populism, almost since the 50s. Since the 50s, we know populism in economists through the study of development experiences that took place in Latin America. All Latin American countries went through populistic processes or phases where in the 90s there was the macroeconomics dominance, tax dominance. We wanted to meet the resolve the problem through major investment in fiscal policies, and then we had the different form, which is the macroeconomic, which drew decisions on businesses, investment, and so on and so forth. Well, so we know this, but as you said, André, there is something that is essential. The starting point of populisms, and the starting point of populism in Latin America was always took place in a complex of high inequalities and at the economical level of low growth rate, a macroeconomic environment that with low growth and and large social inequalities. This is where the economic populism started. You want to move investment or thing because they were convinced that the best way to changing, the best way to fight against social inequalities was growth. We haven't yet had the discussion on the growth that does not create jobs, but it was the classic vision. And from then on, the different phases, we know that populism goes through different phases. The expansion phase, then the advent of difficulties, and then the phase where clearly everything collapses, inflation rises, and the imbalance of accounts increases, and the situation is such that we ask the international institution to overcome this situation. And this is what we see in the economic literature. If they start from good intentions, which was to fight against inequalities, and to boost growth, but they, because of the end up with harsh austerity policies, which turn against those who were supposed to serve. So clearly, there is major interest, even though they. Anyway, there is always the question of economic populism, but despite all the characteristics, there is a true. This economic literature did pinpoint a real problem, and the real problem is the issue of inequalities, social, and the growth. And this is the question we ask today in different terms, which is the inclusive growth. How do we make sure that we'll have inclusive growth? We create jobs, solidarity, and solve inequality. And what has been said at the time, what was said at the time was the answers given were answers dealt with some of this paper, but there is so how can we build inclusive growth? Second point, it is the globalization of economic populism. As I said, populism was clearly, in terms of reflection, in terms of economic policies, was a field of reflection and studies where we'll find non-economists, but it was limited to geographical area. Now there's a new phenomenon, that is, it is the development at the global level. That is, the populist temptation is found all over the world. I live in Africa and the Arab world, and the populistic temptation where it was foreign to the economic and political tradition, but we see it now. Clearly, it is growing a bit more and being installed, and there are vocation and parties who claim to be or having the same discourse, betrayal of elites at the economic level, the betrayal of elites, and and giving the and different form of democracy, and this is also found. If you look at Asia, we see it in the Philippines, in certain Asian countries, and we see it as well at the heart of liberal democracies in the European Union, Hungary, and other countries, and of course, as you explained, André, in some aspects, the policies applied by the Trump administration is very close to the economic populism. So the question we could ask ourselves is, why is there a globalization and the politistic economic temptation? And I think one element of answer is the idea, the best environment, having the best environment. Well, they have to. It is often to show the level of corruption of some population. This is an argument used by the various populist movement. But the most important thing is clearly the crisis of globalization. Books of Thomas Piketty or even works of institutions like the World Bank. Horowitz shows the impacts of inequality, of marginalization, and basically of the descaling of certain social classes. And we end up with democracies where democracy lost its social content and base, and what remains are the political institutions. That was, I think, the key element of this, of the rise of populism at the global level, of this development at the international level, and of course the temptation. We've seen the French elections with the temptations of. We can discuss the positions, but anyway, do we find that in every country of the world? With the same complaints that we find in Latin America. The same complaint about the government, which the movement that prevented this drift of complaints about the independence of central banks, of regional integration, the attempt of regional integration which impose supranational roles in terms of tax or in certain number of things, in terms of against countries which develop policies or which impose some rules. Functioning rules in terms of funding or through central banks, budgetary deficit, or other things. So clearly, the same phenomenon in Latin America, or the quest of a social contract and of inclusive growth, of inclusive economic growth, as it was at the origin of unfortunate experience of economic policies in Latin America. It is at the heart of a temptation of global economic populism. Third point I'd like to mention now, it's a century-old question, what to do, what should we do? When our Lebanese colleague mentioned a series of question and answers, clearly we come back to all the discussions. Is there war between economic third way between economic populism, whose dangers and drifts are serious, not only at the political level, but also at the political level, but also austerity policies. I can see, for example, the austerity policies imposed today after the period of opening from the national institution, especially at the time of the pandemics, and today, after the pandemics, and today, at the time of the war in Ukraine, So we see some kind of normalization of economic policies, and we're back to normal, and the objective is macroeconomic stabilization, so we have to reduce deficits, and from then on, We have to reduce expenditures. And even we know in Tunisia they want to stop social subsidies. I'm not a I've loved done in Macquarie National Institution, but I think we have to think about a certain number of things. It is important today to think about what policy, what answer is to be provided today to a social crisis. Well, we have states which today cannot provide to help the citizens and to help unable to have dynamic policies and proactive in terms of jobs. And a country like Tunisia, for example, or many other Arab-speaking countries or Maghreb countries which belong to the intermediate economies. We went through the COVID-19 as because it was a drama, because it was the deterioration of the structures and health policies, So, sorry, clearly there is a new reflection to be launched, and this a reflection that if France has started, then I think for us, you at the Cercle, les rencontres du Cercle et les INEX, and think tanks like the one I'm facilitating in Tunis are synonym of reflection, how to pull out of this closure and this blocking between austerity and, on the other side, the temptation to break all this and to impose new economic policies. We can only lead to a third way. I think research attempts are being made. We have to see today. We have to see the experience of negotiation between Brazil and Argentina. Argentina, with support of Stiglitz, and well, has been able to achieve an agreement. Well, the growth dimension prevails over the conventional notion of austerity. We'll see what this will say. So we have to conclude now.
So in economics, we think that crisis periods are periods of innovation where there should be thinking. It's what Daniel Okri says. We have to experiment during these periods. We have to launch new experiments. Yes, that was very interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much, Hakim. So 2 questions were asked, but unfortunately we won't have time to continue. But I will pass them on to our guests. Let me just say a few words to conclude. What struck me, based on the 2 notions of globalization of populism, is the parallel that we can see between the collapse of the international regime that we had after the war, including international rules. What's striking is that all countries impacted by populism are countries that were highly indebted from the point of view of the other countries. So there were public and private financiers who didn't really worry about what was happening. I'm sorry, we no longer have the sound in the interpreting booth. Excusez-moi, j'ai
bonjour à tous.
So, hello everybody. Thank you for being here for this last panel discussion of the day. And the theme is media and experts. How do we dialogue? How do you foster dialogue between media and experts? So we have Kirsty Savron with us, who is to my right. So Kirsty Loken. So the translation should be working, Kirsty. Kirsty is perhaps not on the right channel. I can introduce her though, can I not? So Kirsty has a big media group in Norway, and she's the head of the governmental commission focusing on freedom of speech. Just beside her, we have Leonardo Curcio, who's a political scientist, journalist, member of CISAM, attached to the Autonomous University in Mexico. Then we have David Lasfargue, who's a lawyer, an international lawyer. He's an associate of the Janté firm. And just next to me, we have Laurent Gumier, who's Director of Information at France Television. So just a few words by way of introduction so that so on this theme, media and experts, of course, there are different ways of entering into the subject. One is to start with competition that we are seeing in terms of information, accessing information, grabbing people's attention. And I think it questions the role of experts. Experts need time. Experts are professionals of their field. Sadly, we should have had a doctor with us, but unfortunately, he's having to do a liver transplant today, so he couldn't come, our surgeon. So the role of experts has been undermined because of the competition between social media and traditional media. So there are cognitive sciences that tell us that we all have confirmation biases. So the more information we receive that is in line with what we think, the more we want to read that information, and the more reticent we are to hear different voices, different experts. So often it's not easy, experts and what they have to say. So is it good to always listen to experts? Social media are based on multitude, whether we're talking about Twitter or Facebook. If we take these two media, Twitter and Facebook are based on media effects, and that explains the domination of these platforms. The fact that we're kind of taken up in a flow of people who think like us, and that's very dangerous. It's very dangerous for the traditional media model, but also when it comes to what experts have to say. So the role of experts is difficult enough in traditional media, but when there are opinions that group together, it's even more difficult for experts. The other big question is, so what do experts talk about? So after the crisis and in the 2010s, we questioned the role of economists. We said that, they were all talking about banks. They work in banks. They've worked in the financial sector. They've not planned ahead. They haven't warned us about the risks that were on their way. And there was a big questioning that affected economists. But we also know that this questioning also affected scientists, and notably doctors, in their relationship with pharmaceutical labs, pharmaceutical companies. Is what they say, is it legitimate when they're being paid by pharmaceutical companies? So it's all of these questions that we're going to try and talk about together. And I'm first of all going to hand over to Kirsty, who now is able to listen to the translation, apparently.
I stop and talk for myself. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for the ability to discuss an extremely interesting topic, I think. I'm head of the Norwegian government's Commission on Freedom of Expression. We're a group of 15, 16 people that for 2.5 years have been diving into all aspects of freedom of expression in Norway, legally and not least within social media. And we are about to deliver a huge report to the Norwegian government in August. So I cannot tell you anything about that because it will be secret until the minister will get it. But I would like to approach our debate by starting in social media, which I find extremely interesting. Because if we follow discussions on freedom of expression and follow discussions on social media, there will probably always be something negative attached to that discussion. There are problems, there are some wrongs, there are some faults, there are rude people, there are hate speech, there are trolls, also there are echo chambers. And even though we are discussing all these things all the time, there is a huge democratization going on in front of us. We have never seen anything like it, probably when we started printing books by Gutenberg, but not any other changes in the public sphere can relate to what we are seeing. The voiceless are getting a voice. Those who are not that good at writing or presenting themselves, they do in social media. They misspell, they mistake things, they do wrong, but they're public people. My approach to freedom of expression is that it belongs to the civil society, and if we agree on that, all the way ahead of us, there are huge paradoxes in the development. For instance, when we're now discussing the regulation of social media, we see that the regulation implies that the governments have more and more to say of our freedom of expression, because they're given power over the social platforms and not the civil society, as it should have been. And those are really challenging things that we should be preoccupied with. But if we agree that we are living through extremely interesting times, extremely democratic times, when we are able to listen to all kinds of voices, as you say, all kinds of experts and not so expert people also, unfortunately, but they're part of this huge choir that we're all a part of. I think there are two angles or perspectives that we need to be very aware of when we are discussing experts and we're discussing who is it worthwhile listening to, and not least all the troubles that we see on social platforms. And that is to remind ourselves to look at all these things in a power and class perspective. I think lots of the challenges that we are discussing relates to the fact that there are people in power that are challenged by more not so powerful people. And it also has to do with not so qualified people trying to take part in a debate while being not so good at expressing themselves, not so good at spelling, and not so good at understanding either. But if we start calling that trolls or hate speech, I think we are on a very wrong place. Even though there are hate speech, as I also admit, lots of it isn't, and lots of it we never mind defining what is hate and what is trolling in social media. So one perspective I think it's important to remind us is this. And the other thing is, of course, much more challenging, but still true, and that is that all the problems that we see in social media, all the problems that we see with freedom of expression, was there already. Social media is amplifying problems in society that was already there. Social media is showing the powerful the problems that they didn't relate that much to before people got a voice of their own. Like, for instance, Maria Ressa, as you probably have heard of, the Philippine editor that got the Nobel Peace Prize, by the way, in Norway last year. She, of course, often talks about the problems that social media creates in the Philippines. But I think we also need to remind ourselves that the problems in the Philippines were there before social platforms. The Philippines had lots of things to deal with before people had an account on Facebook and Twitter. And that is, I think, a reminder that I think the best way to combat what we see as problems with freedom of expression is a general education, is access of information to all people, so they're better equipped to dealing with the debates, with the facts, with the points of view that we that are much more privileged maybe, that can sit at conferences and discuss these things, that not all are that privileged. So I think that when we are about to embark on a debate on experts, I think we all also should remind ourselves that lots of things in the public debate is about feelings. It's emotional, and that will always be a challenge to the experts, I think.
Thank you, Kersti.
So I'm delighted to be here at the table with you. So I'm going to suggest 3 points to think about. First of all, the national debate, the national conversation, and the consequences of the logic of social media and the superlative breaking up of social dialogue and the destruction of the media universe that was replaced by a pluriverse peopled with isolated discourse and sometimes insolent discourse. So a political discourse that is less ideological and more focused on identities. In fact, there isn't really a systematic discourse. So it's not exactly systematic, but there are messages à la carte that aim to seduce populations and communities who feel that they are excluded or discriminated against, who are a bit cross and who are ignored. And these messages are built to the detriment of experts, discipline and truth. So that these communities couldn't care about balanced analyses, and that's why the role of experts has become marginal in the conversations of these communities. The discourse is contested, it's superfluous, and it's manipulated. And a political discourse, an economic discourse and identity discourse, this is another point that I would like to detail, tries to bring together all fears and angers and frustrations, and above all uncertainties, and replace them with a linear logic that is hypersimplistic. Populations like their leaders because they reassure them and give them a sense of relevance and belonging, and they detest the theorization about complexity and sophisticated analyses. And I can understand that. Their reactions against the establishment, the academic establishment, journalists, the meritocracy is hostile. So we're not liked, and experts are perceived like CEOs beforehand in the class society. They are responsible for channeling inequalities. It's, it's the hierarchy. According to me, it's important to understand that doesn't mean justify this society, which is full of fears and uncertainties. Identity neopopulism that is talked about in the Americas, it's like a weed in democracy. We need some kind of glyphosate or some kind of herbicide that might work. And our work is to separate the chaff, to winnow things through. So we need to think about the hot topic of the times. We've got regressive utopias, as we're seeing in the Americas. We've got dystopias. So we have to adapt, even if that seems to be quite complicated. There's no shortcut. Adaptation, even resilience, need reforms. And these reforms have to be politically acceptable. We've also got to bring down fallacious discourse and recover truth. Make sure that it's a central value, even if that's unpleasant. China, migration is here. China is doing what it's doing. And all of the problems that we're seeing today, they're oppressive. And what I would like to share now is a last point. We need to accept the idea that experts are not popular. People don't like us. But I think we need a little bit more flexibility. We need to be more flexible. We need to change what we're saying. We need to be more empathetic with the population at large. We need to adapt to the emotions and important topics of populations. Inflation, for example, is a percentage. It's a percentage rate, but it's also a tragedy for families. And I think that the media and experts need to understand that it's a rate, but it's also a tragedy. Thank you very much. David. So normally the microphone should work. Yes, it's working. Yes, good evening. So when I was preparing this debate, I wondered how my experience as a lawyer could be useful to the debate. And of course, this leads me to a thought. When we talk about experts, we think about legal experts, not just the experts that we can see on TV shows or social media. We think of the persons appointed by courts or when there is arbitration to be done. How do we define these experts? If we look at an expert in common law, in the etymological sense of the word, it's the person who has proven their worth, somebody who has knowledge, who has something to say, who can demonstrate that they've got knowledge and they can share it with you. From a legal point of view, an expert, a judicial expert, is a person who has been appointed, to give an opinion that's going to help with a decision. So we have two definitions then, two definitions that are not that different, but they don't exactly overlap. So can we draw something out of that? Can we conclude something from that so that experts who are being criticized today can perhaps get organized so that they are less criticized? So there's a first remark that I can make. First of all, this idea makes sense, because when we're talking about experts, whatever the type of expert, a doctor, an economist, a lawyer, or somebody in geopolitics. So the expectations in relation to the experts are the same. But the problem that is criticized is that of independence. What do we expect from an expert? Generally, we expect an expert to have knowledge that can not be questioned by the expert's peers. We expect the expert, because of their experience, to take on board different opinions, to be able to communicate and to take part in debates. And the most important point, we expect the expert to be honest, competent and independent. So this is an ideal world that I'm describing, you will say. We need experts who depend on nobody else, experts who are credible, who are believed by everybody, who act as an authority. They have scientific, technical knowledge that cannot be questioned, and their neutrality is irreproachable. Now, in practice, the dependency factors are multiple. Experts are dependent on the state because they are state nationals. They're dependent on the authority that they belong to. They are dependent on the company employing them or providing them with resources. And experts are dependent on scientific communities that they are part of, the networks that they belong to. And sometimes there are many of these. So when we think about all of this, and you know, it's something that applies to all experts. It's not new. You know, it's not something that has come about because of social media. Perhaps we can maybe talk about two proposals. The first is to say, why are experts so decried today? They're criticized for two reasons. First of all, because we consider that they are paid to plead for causes, and that's, they come up with arguments to plead causes because they're paid for that. But they're also being reproached to have, because they have links, connections with interest groups, and who are hidden above all, and that's a big no-no. So the main, avenues are those when we think about experts. So now coming back to what has been done in law and what has been done for judicial experts, people who are appointed for arbitration or for contracts. So the first avenue there to be explored is to democratize expertise. In other words, to strengthen pluralism and to import this idea of what is contradictory, to use the jurisdictional model, especially the contradictory procedure, a confrontation that is organized between different visions. Can we not consider as desirable, for example, when we have objectivity, independence, impartiality objectives, to have experts? It's desirable to have experts who talk together, who present different views, and in all kinds of areas. So let's democratize expertise. That means that we're respecting pluralism and the responsibility, the accountability of these experts while they're fulfilling their assignments. So it's an objective. It's not something that can be decreed. But I think it's the first avenue that can be explored. We can open things up. We can be careful so that things are not as... It's not the social media who dictate points of view. And the second avenue that can be explored is perhaps a little bit more legal. It relates to the status of the expert as a solution to the evolution that is taking place a little bit too quickly. So if we look at what's happened to experts who work on arbitration, and there are many of those today in economic life, there are many statuses, charters, regulations, contracts with institutions. We can see a certain number of points, for example, that are at once very important, but at the same time correspond to all kinds of experts, whatever their speciality. So transparency about recruitment conditions and an expert's qualifications. Where does the expert come from? Why has the expert been chosen? Secondly, there's the obligation for experts to declare any interest that they may have. So, it's about measuring how independent they are or how dependent they are. And this can be done in different ways because, if you don't have a conflict of interest with a more exhaustive declaration and a CV that is, restricts the expert. So experts must also comply with deontological rules, and this should be part of a charter that needs to be put up by the different media or different institutions.
So when I talk about ontology, I'm talking about that of the original profession of the expert, but also that of the ontological rules which may apply to the fact that introduce himself or herself as an expert and is listened to as an expert. So in this deontology, I think it is essential, for example, that the expert commits himself to be loyal, sincere, to give an exhaustive vision of a problem, respect pluralism, and therefore provide analysis, solutions, options, which is not necessarily sharing or supporting. So two leads simply to starting from what exists and of this problem, which is the world old, the legal expert, insurance expert, whatever expert, being always careful, We don't want to regulate the freedom of speech. This is where the danger lies. We have to be very cautious. And this is why I said we're talking about soft law. We're not talking about binding legislation. We want to implement a new deontology charter and accountability of the various media, which most of them do have that, for and to ensure plurality and qualities that must be that the experts must exhibit whenever they deal with public issues. Of course, the question is the media are orchestrating all this. They choose the expert they invite on the TV stages, and media love to have frontal oppositions, conflicts, which sometimes are not quite compatible with an expertise discourse. Tell us how you see things. Thank you. It's nice to be the last speaker. That gives me time to think, but it's a problem because you've said a lot of things, and all my smart remarks are gone. So I have to be short so we can have a discussion, enlightened discussion. So being the journalist on stage, the official journalist on stage, I want to see how the three notions, which is the expert, the media, and the social network, how those three notions interact today. Collide sometimes, and even sometimes happen to work together and produce something interesting. So I think the traditional couple media expert, which has existing since the media have always existed, you know, expert in newspaper, radio, television, selected by an editor. Well, this couple is somewhat damaged because the advent of social networks about 20 years ago completely exploded the first thing, which was essential, which is, and I think in my opinion, structures conversations here, the traditional role of media to be the filter of collective, which is there is an edition group, and they can decide, having discussed, you know, having discussed it, debated it, who is the expert and who is not. What has changed in the last 20 years that the entry ticket as an expert, well, it's collapsed. You know, it's the zero now. You know, everybody is an expert, and everybody is not an expert. Has the ability to actually pretend and to describe his or her expertise, share it, expand it, expose it on social networks. It started with the blogs 15 years ago. I was part of those who said, and I still think that blogs were great, actually. You know, you're saying early on, you know, it's kind of a democracy, you know, new democracy of free speech, opinion, views, and ability to say interesting things. And it's often more interesting that some journalists can say it, actually, because, you know, it brings us back to 15 years ago when the blog experts, or in aeronautics, in agriculture, or in technologies, or, those expertise came from real experts, actually, and who brought in and gave citizens additional information to what was given by the main media, and then expert journalists usually, and less expert than a woman or a man who's been an expert in his or her domain for the last 30 years. So this deregulation that we've been experiencing for about 20 years, it's once more the entry ticket today in the field of expertise has collapsed. And unlike what you were saying earlier on, David, of course, when justice selects an expert, I won't discuss the way the experts are selected, but anyway, it is based on, that selection is based on objective criteria. You know, a past, a body of work, you know, deontological resume, experience, lack of conflict of interest, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the expert is someone reliable and well identified. Today, anybody on the social network can claim to be an expert. Okay, this is quite trivial. We all know, okay, all this is the fault of a social network. We, the media, we pure and virgin. You know, we never made a mistake. No. What has changed is porosity and the contamination between what goes on social network and what some media, I'm not saying all the media, some media practice, that is, they go and get on the social media people who claim to be expert, and because then they go in the media and then become I mean, they've received the benediction of the media sanctity, and they reinforce their pseudo statue of pseudo expert. But anyway, to be very simple, we go and get someone on the social network. He comes on the TV stage, and after that, of course, he is an expert. Come on the social networks, he will have more followers, and then will climb more expert, become more expert than he was previously. This vicious circle, this contamination between social networks and media, this is what is causing this kind of dysfunctioning, global dysfunctioning. But it is the role of, what the editing group, the ultimate responsibility of media is to resist. That is to keep working, not as if social network did not exist, but still keep working, check, ensure traceability, ensure the reliability of the discourse, of the rationale, lack of conflict of interest, resist the facility of fishing, picking self-proclaimed expert on social networks. The second one, which characterizes the time in which we live, is the amazing brutality that we experience in social networks, brutality, violence. Which is that of, the Wild West. A few years ago, I wrote a text because I still keep that all this is a revolution, beneficial, but it was happier 15 years ago than it is today. And I described this Wild West as being the promising land that, to imagine new content, to progress education, education, democracy, and so on and so forth. And for the Wild West, well, I like, I don't like, I dislike, I love you, and I kill you, and I ghost you, and you're gone. So it's total absence of feedback, experience and ability to listen, you being defriended, So as we said, the ability that the media has to allow a form of expertise to grow and to be discussed with serenity. I think media today lack totally serenity. They have, not all media, not all the columns, again, I'm saying it, but, and this is the second aspect, the second facet. Third one, it is the era we're entering, and this is even more worrisome. It's even scary. By the way, I don't see the world in black. I have a couple of lovely light solutions, but right now, things are a bit scary. Today we tend to think that impartiality, the neutrality, which is the basis of the approval of a journalist within a redaction, is floating, going away. And the young generation, the youngest generation coming today in the newspapers or media did not know the disconnected, free, screen-less society, and society without social network, because schools of journalism don't necessarily do well their work, think that you have to be brutal, being engaged, and sometimes forget to be impartiality, to be heard and to be useful. The notion of media, fully impartial media, which will give all the opinions. You can listen and hear experts from both sides. Well, sometimes tends to dissolve. And we see now a lot of media today, or in politics and elsewhere, who are only talking about commitment and who give the floor to a certain category of experts and who never compare two expertise. Of course, when you say a lot of media ensure debate and confrontation, but there are many of media where confrontation don't exist. All the experts said the same thing. They interviewed with, with a form of communication militantism. This is very dangerous for the journalists. I'll stop now because I'm telling you that journalism will die, the media will die, the journalists will die, and I hope we can talk about something else. Okay, we have a reaction from Kirsten.
I agree with Laurent. It's interesting to listen, then you get new thoughts on this. And I think for the point of clarification, I think it's important to say that I don't think we really discuss being an expert, but how to become an expert that is listened to. And that is how to reach out to the audience, how to get your opinion or your facts heard and notified. And I think that all comes down to credibility. And how to build credibility, as David proposed a charter. I think it boils down to ethics. Sometimes simple ethics like being transparent and being transparent about not being independent, for instance, but also it comes down to if you're good at communicating. It was easier before because then a journalist can tell the audience this is a guy you can trust. No, you have to earn your position on your own, more and more, I think. But then I also think that we should remind ourselves that it is an extremely privileged position to be an expert that people listen to. And one should be humble about it and not so much maybe criticizing people for not listening that much. And I also think that the lack of ethics from other experts are also destroying the possibilities for the ethical ones to achieve their position, obviously. But I do think all this will eventually bring back power to the edited media. Oh, you didn't see that one coming. But I do think we have had some years now when we lack the self-confidence in the editorial departments because of social media, but we see more and more that there has to be a position for well-edited, credible media that can sort things out, that can bring trusted facts around. But that also depends on the journalists being good enough. So it. I think, I guess this is the kind of question that we will discuss for years and years to come. But I still think that people that have a sense of belonging, as you mentioned, to their society, I think that's a good starting point for building trust in a society, and also that you have experts understanding. As I think your remark was very good, that inflation is not a technical thing, it's a catastrophe. You have to have experts understanding the way people live and what they sort of challenge with.
Merci. Je voudrais établir deux clivages qui sont...
I'd like to mention two cleavages or two differences which in my opinion are most important. First, credibility of experts and media. We have to acknowledge that this revolt against the elite is impacting us directly. People say, well, this revolt against the establishment, it is also a revolt against the so-called expert, the academy, the National School of Administration, and so on and so forth. So we have to be self-critical of, and if people who give their opinion to the media, well, it's not always an issue of competence or incompetence. It's okay, you know, you can say what you want about the economy, law, you know, debate on constitution, but if you're not credible, even if you got the diploma, but your speech, you know, is not good, we end up with a communication crisis. Here comes the second element I'd like to discuss with you. Bless you. So the ecosystem where we live, if we imagine a swimming pool, for example, well, you don't have the pristine water on one side and the sewers on the other side, you know, and we got a swimming pool where we got truth, we mix truth and lies, and this is reality. This is reality in open democratic countries, and which comes from the social media, but also in media there are a lot of interests. There are trolls are bought by foreign governments, and there are interests which build debates which are fully artificial debates, you know, fake debates. And we are not here building up a dialogue, a national dialogue with citizens, informed citizens who are pure and noble and who have the best intentions. I mean, there are also vested interests, somewhat doubtful when it comes to, you know, and behind certain trends. And we have to acknowledge that, you know, our ecosystem they comprise a cohabitation between clean things and dirty things. So it's not just of signing charter. Okay, fair enough. But right now, you can sign a sheet of paper, but if you're not credible, you know, you first let's reconcile ourselves with our audience and with the population before saying, now here we have the truth, here the truth as our pivotal point, and on the other side, I cannot guarantee in terms of social network that it is the same thing. So I really want to establish those 2 points, which, in my opinion, in a part start from the merit of having a national discussion. Truth. Okay, the problem with social networks is that the borderline between what it belongs to knowledge and what belongs to opinion is rather blurry, and therefore what appears as true, something which is just the fact that it is a shared opinion by a certain number of people who are together because, you know, you will read people who think like you. So there's no questioning or challenging of this truth to opinion, which is not the truth. So I think the main question in this, okay, we agree, we heard there must be good journalists, as Kirsten said. Laurent mentioned that all media are not playing on the frontal opposition, like, you know, it's no longer a debate, it's a collision. Now, so what happens when in the media nobody is subscribing to a newspaper, nobody looks the 8 o'clock news on any channel, and everybody insulting one another with streets, Facebooks and other, and if I may add, because this is a question for you, but in fact, indeed, there is the problem of self-proclamation of expert, what was said early on, you know, I published and this and that, and then the responsibility of the media who invite them on TV stages or radio studio, but we don't look at the newspapers. We don't read the newspapers. Look at the main news at 7, 8, or 9 o'clock. We don't respect the so-called respectable media as being the guarantor of integrity and domination of experts, whereas in the past we would respect, if you were the expert invited to France Television or the Norwegian news channel, well, you were respected. So I hope I did not contaminate you. 10 million people still look at main news on TV. Millions of people are subscribing to newspapers and magazines. But you're right, trends are not ramping up, they're ramping down. So again, this is a story which is about 20-year-old. You know, there is no frontal opposition between the social network and media. We are on the social networks. The question is, how can we deploy our capacities, our expertise of journalists to differentiate truth from false, fake from real on social networks, exactly as we do in our newspapers or in our editing meetings. So we have to be. We want to be everywhere. Where do we want to be? Everywhere where the public is in contact with the information, the true, false, fake, real, garbage or reality. So the ability to work on social network is a field, it's a playing field, physical field and the digital field, where journalists have to go and seek and label and sort, you know, do a bit of sorting, screening by saying possibly in 50 years the 8 o'clock news or the main news, the news television news will have a different form, possibly. Maybe linear television, linear radio will not exist. That's not the point. The issue is, will there be editing room where people will get and seek information? I don't want to be, and it's not, it's not negative. I do believe that television will exist because always when television came, people said radio will disappear. You know, it's a kind of market sharing. You know, it's an arbitration that's done by the public as to the way they consume media. But of course, there is a generation gap. The young generation under 20 is glued to the screen, but not the television one. And that's not all right. What's essential, and we'll discuss that later on about that. For me, the solution, well, it's not the solution, but it's, the borderline between, I talked about Wild West, you know, the crucial point, a crucial point to bear in mind for the last 20 years is to say that we should teach children, basically, to be informed, and as we teach them to read, you know, it's how to consume information as you consume books today, beyond the great efforts made by the CLEMI, the media, but whatever. To learn to get informed is something that for democracy, for our democracies, will be vital in the next 20 years. And this will shift completely the societies either in dictatorship or will keep them on the right side. Kirsten, and then Leonardo. Just a question. Who will be responsible for the pedagogy if you want to teach children how to get informed? Well, it's a political choice. It's a political choice. It's the way you will educate our children. Then after that, the parents. But the problem is that you, again, there's something, but this revolution started 20 years ago. We are 1 or 2, 3 generations lost. I hope they're lost. I hope the coming generation will be taken into, we will teach them how to get informed like we were not. But for us, it's normal. We deal with it the way we can. We had, well, not the youngest here, but we known a life when there was no connection, no social network, no internet. I'm not saying it was better, but we can handle it, you know. We still, well, okay, we got a couple of reflex from the past saying attention, whatever. But of course, a kid who's 15 today, who's never known anything else, you know, who doesn't have the same references, and mainly who is not in a family where there are books, and who has the social, intellectual, and cognitive resource to educate the children to get informed and sort the truth from the false or the fake from the real. There is a gap which is opening, which is widening, and in my opinion, in the political sense of the word, you know, it is urgent to reduce that. Kirsten.
Well, yeah, I do think we have to realize that this is a never-ending battle to bring people on board, to try to see to that not so many people are left behind when it comes to being vitally informed. And I must also remind ourselves that those who were born around when social media arrived, they are now in universities. Those are the ones who are taking masters and bachelors at the time. And one of them is my son, and I see he's studying law and he reads Dostoevsky, so I cannot find it that hopeless. I must also remind us that. I see there are young people here too. So I think the world is always developing forward, and there we have some setbacks. And one of them we saw recently in Norway last week, because Jens Stoltenberg is the head of NATO. He signed this agreement with the members, Finland and the new members of NATO, Finland and Sweden, and then suddenly the medias in Norway were attacked by Russian forces, Russian digital forces. Suddenly they were struggling to get the newspaper printed, which is of course a new kind of warfare. And I think what we've discussed mainly now is our human challenges, but then we have the not so human challenges. And what if something takes my night's sleep, it's the deep fakes, which I think it's a logic reason for not trusting what you see in media. And also the bots that Elon Musk maybe is not buying Twitter because of, but still there were always bots at Twitter, so why didn't you see them? But anyway, you have these bots, but then you also have this digital war going on, and I would like to hear what you think, because Norway is a small country, 5 million people. We haven't had that kind of warfare in our arena yet, but how to deal with that? Those are really, really, as I said, the true reasons for not trusting what you see in the media and the social media.
Anybody want to react? No? Oh, so on a plus.
We don't really have time, but can we perhaps take one question from the room? Thank you. I agree with everything that's been said, but there's one thing that also seems important to me, and that's the professionalization of experts. And at the end of the day, we have experts who no longer work in their specific fields. They just tell a story, and so they've lost the connection with their expertise. It's a bit the same in politics. When you're a politician, you're everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So, you know, we're getting people to talk who are not experts. And so we come back to the question of legitimacy. And then there's this question of narcissism, ego. How do you change that? Because it's unbearable. It's always the same people, these professionals, and it's in all fields. They claim that they're experts, and they simply postulate. Yes, I agree. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. There isn't a question there, though, really, is there? So I'm talking from the point of view of media. So it's up to us to resist that facility, to find the means when we think about somebody who we invite up onto a stage for a debate. We have to think, you know, properly before we invite them, and not to just go with the flow and say to ourselves, okay, let's just invite that person because, you know, we know who they are, they've been before. And that's what we're fighting for. You know, public services must not be dependent just on that kind of thing. And we need to find the right experts. 30 seconds. Yeah, this is why I was saying earlier on that we have to set up a deontology of experts so that a COVID expert doesn't become an American expert or you know, it's fairly basic. You know, you have expertise in a specific domain. So so we have to have deontology. So social media and traditional media. This is, you know, this is something that you've got to take into account. You're allowed to do that. You're allowed to choose your experts, and then the feedback would be better. I don't think we've closed the debate, but thank you, everybody.